Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry coming at you here with coverage of the ongoing Third World War. It is the first week of August, or rather the end of the first week of August here at the time of this recording, and the Strait of Hormuz apparently is on the verge of having a deal announced between Iran and Oman about its control. The Iranians have asserted total IRGC control over the strait. They are insisting on charging tolls. We're going to be getting into all the details. Trump's frustration with the quote-unquote duplicitous Iranian negotiation tactics, the Iranian strikes on Iraqi Kurdistan, of course, what's happening with the Yemeni Houthis, who are sort of stealing the spotlight as far as the ongoing regional Middle Eastern war is concerned with their strikes on Saudi Arabia, their blockade of the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and the Red Sea, and of course, their threats, obviously, against Israel. Of course, Israel is continuing their terror campaigns across Palestine, into Lebanon, and even into Syria. The Gaza strikes have escalated recently, so we're going to be discussing all of this. Of course, what's going on in the Black Sea as Russia blockades Odessa, the situation with Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, the huge defense deal that was signed between those three countries, a NATO-like defense pact. If one comes under attack by a foreign nation, the others will be obligated to defend it. So obviously, there are some major escalations that were about to occur in the region that this likely prompted, or rather that this deal, which was in the works, I'm sure, behind the scenes, got escalated and moved to the fore, I'm sure, at the likely approval of the United States. So we're going to be discussing all of that, what we think is coming next, how we think that defense treaty may play out as, I believe, the inevitable American-Israeli escalation against Iran comes, and Armageddon, World War III level strikes, the destruction of Gulf energy that will ultimately precipitate, many experts think, end of August, early September. I know Cameron McGregor and others have been naming that as when they think the kicking over the football, the planned footsie, the fake negotiations, the diplomacy theater will ultimately wrap up, and America will be forced to go in and do what they plan on doing, whether it's ground operations in the islands, whether it's some other big operation. Who knows? I mean, with this treaty, maybe they want to drag Turkey in on the ground somehow. There's all sorts of fanciful ideas that I'm sure the State Department and the Pentagon are drawing up. So we're going to be discussing all of that and so much more. Of course, the fronts in Russia, Ukraine, what's going on with irregular migration and, other warfare being waged against European civilization in Europe, and, the aftermath of the Ceuta and Melilla invasion. Be sure to listen to our Ether Hour episode this week with Jose Nino. We fully debrief the migrant invasion of Spanish Ceuta and discuss what happened there, the Israeli origins of that assault, the Francoist roots of French anti-Zionism, or rather Spanish anti-Zionism. So be sure to check all of that out. It's linked down below. A great conversation with Jose Nino. We're going to be discussing all of that and, of course, wrapping things up with church news. So thank you again all so much for tuning in. Be sure to give this episode a like. And again, get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co to listen to that Ether Hour episode. But it's great to have you here with me, Dmitry. How are you doing? It's been a big week. Of course, we are still waiting for that big escalation.
Certainly a big week of anticipation, following the news very closely. Of course, there is some anxiety for those living in the Middle East, for those in Eastern Europe, everyone's waiting for some form of escalation, be it from President Vladimir Putin, be it from President Donald J. Trump, or even a response by the Iranians and premeditated strike, and this constant warfare happening on multiple fronts, specifically between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Ansar Allah Houthis, and of course, this is currently a genocide taking place in Palestine, the Holy Land, and of course, just north in the lands of the Cedar, of course, Lebanon. So there is some major news to cover, especially, as you said, in relation to diplomacy and military defense pacts, which I think will have lasting consequences. This will be one of those episodes we will make reference to for maybe months, if not years to come.
Most definitely. Again, I think we are really in the calm before the true storm. Of course, again, the Middle East itself is not calm. Dozens of troops are being killed in Yemen. People are being killed in Gaza. Israel is advancing in Lebanon. Iran continues to strike Iraqi Kurdistan, major casualties every day. So again, it's not quiet, but it's still quiet compared to what we know is coming with what operation the Americans and Israelis will attempt, and of course the inevitable and now very much understood Iranian response. So that is what we're all waiting for. But of course, on August 3rd, Trump made this big announcement. He said, Iranian leadership is unbelievably duplicitous. They ask for a meeting. Some would say beg. Talks begin with more scheduled in the immediate future. And they say openly and proudly that they're not having any discussions, that nothing is being talked about, and they're only dealing with Oman. They then go on to give their usual blather in saying the Strait of Hormuz will be operated powerfully by them when it is already completely controlled by the United States Navy in our blockade, or as some say, the United States wall of steel. Nothing gets through to Iran unless we want it to. but nothing will get through unless a deal or total surrender is accomplished. Whether Iran wants to admit it or not, we are, in fact, talking of a solution to a problem that they have caused for decades. It is very simple. Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. Thank you for attention to this matter. So, of course, we're going to be dissecting all of the ways in which that is about to be completely disproven. But before we get into some deeper analysis, I want to encourage everybody once again to like this episode, regardless of what platform you're listening on. Give it a like, leave a comment, let us know what you think is coming next in the Third World War. We'd love to hear your perspective. Of course, if you're not already a subscriber at worldwarnow.co, please consider doing so, free or paid. We'd love to get you on the free subscriber list. It's a great way to support the show, help us grow. And of course, if you want to support us even further, get behind the paywall again at worldwarnow.co and get access to all hundreds and hundreds of hours of our Ether Hour backlog. So many interviews with incredible guests like Jose Nino this week, Father Peter Heers in previous weeks, Father John Whiteford, Abbot Shrifan, so many other incredible guests. Nick Griffin, former member of the European Parliament, Yaqub Saraf, former Lebanese defense minister. So really a whole suite of incredible analysis episodes. We have our 3-part series telling the truth about Rasputin. Dmitry and I have some incredible episodes all about the czars, the Romanov czars, going way back. So check that out again at worldwarnow.co. And also be sure to check out antelopehillpublishing.com. A whole suite of incredible right-wing dissident books, incredible new translations, including, of course, Kevin MacDonald's 3rd edition of Culture of Critique, which you can get 10% off of with code WWN at checkout. So whatever you get from antelopehillpublishing.com, be sure to use code WWN at checkout and get 10% off. So that's enough shilling. Again, you can obviously subscribe to us on YouTube, X, all of our platforms are linked down below, but it's time to dive in to this World War III analysis. And of course, the Iranians have repeatedly said that they are not engaging in direct diplomacy with the United States. They're only dealing with Oman, and they're working out their unilateral control of the Strait of Hormuz. Trump, of course, attempts to deny this. Ghalibaf, the parliament speaker of Iran, responded to Trump and said that Trump is engaging in theater diplomacy, citing the U.S. president's many threats and climb downs amidst uncertainty whether a deal with Iran and Oman over the Strait of Hormuz will be reached. He tweeted out, "Massive attack incoming. Wait, never mind. They want to negotiate. That's theater diplomacy on loop, using bullying and broken promises and fake news as leverage is a false strategy. Acknowledge the facts and fulfill your commitments. We don't need more theater," the Iranian parliament speaker added. Iranian officials have said that a deal with Oman over the strait is close, but it won't automatically mean the waterway will be open to all traffic. Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Qasem Ghirababadi said reopening the strait would require the U.S. to live up to its commitments under the U.S.-Iran Memorandum of Understanding, which would include a lifting of the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports and the end of Israel's war in Lebanon. According to recent media reports, the potential Iran-Oman deal would involve inbound ships transiting the strait on the Iranian side, while outbound ships leaving the Persian Gulf would remain close to Oman. Iranian officials have said it would involve service fees, while U.S. officials have said there won't be any kind of toll. Iran's Fars news agency reported on Thursday that a potential draft deal would ban U.S. and Israeli shipping through the strait, and that the ban would apply to other countries involved in the war against Iran, a condition the Trump administration is sure to reject, though it doesn't appear the U.S. is involved in the negotiations at this stage, despite claims from Trump. So, of course, again, the situation between Iran and Oman is happening without any kind of U.S. oversight. There's no, Steve Witkoff or some other Jewish New York real estate person isn't necessarily in the room. So that's why I'm sure the U.S. is most likely to reject whatever outcome they have. This is from War Reporter. It says a diplomat from one of the mediating countries told Axios that Iranian negotiators are waiting for final approvals from the Iranian Supreme National Security Council about the deal with Oman and the U.S. We expect this approval soon, the diplomat said. I don't think the U.S. part is, I think that was added by Axios, probably a direct Barack Ravid addition. And according to the Wall Street Journal, this is a recent report from this past week, Iran has made a few additional demands for opening the Strait of Hormuz under Iranian management in partnership with Oman, including an immediate end to the U.S. naval blockade, the lifting of U.S. sanctions on Iranian oil, petrochemical products, and gas, and an explicit acknowledgement of Iran's right to collect maritime fees. Besides all of this, Iran will have full control over inbound traffic into the Strait of Hormuz and supervision over outbound traffic through Omani waters. There is also a Strategic Control of Hormuz Act being prepared for the Iranian parliament. This is a separate document from the deal being prepared between Iran and Oman about the Persian Gulf Supervision Authority or Transit Authority or whatever it's being called, and how the fees and everything will be managed. This is something that the Iranian parliament is enacting, trying to, I think, push for a more pro-Iranian deal. Point one being the passage of vessels belonging to the United States, Israel, and other hostile countries through the Strait of Hormuz will be prohibited. Two, shipments related to Israel, whether military or civilian, will not have the right to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Three, vessels or cargoes that play any role in action against the resistance front will also be subject to the ban. for countries and individuals that have caused damage to Iran will not receive permission to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and the Persian Gulf compensation is paid until compensation is paid. 5, heavy fines, including up to 20% of the value of the cargo, are planned for violators. 6, the government will assume responsibilities such as guiding navigation, monitoring vessel traffic, and protecting the security and environment of the Persian Gulf in cooperation with the armed forces of the Islamic Republic. This draft is still in the review stage. The parliament has asked experts to submit their suggestions for completing it. And this is from Reuters. Under the Strait of Hormuz deal currently being discussed with Oman, Iran is seeking transit fees of 5 to 7%, the cargo price of vessels passing through the strait. Omani officials are pushing for lower fees of around 3%, while Washington wants zero transit fees. A fully laden, very large crude carrier, VLCC, carries around $150 million worth of oil. A 5% fee would equal $7.5 million per ship, and when considering the average cargo and volume of ships passing through the strait each year, it would net Iran roughly $45 billion in tolls annually. So, that's the current status of debate over the Strait of Hormuz. I would wager Iran, at the very least, they're going to try to get a 3% toll or something. They've openly said that this is for environmental regulation, for tugboats and these sorts of things. And again, America is going to yell and wave their fist and say, this is a violation of international law. But Denmark charges similar, again, very small fees for things going up there through their straits. And of course, Turkey for their tugboat services, their environmental maintenance services through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits into the Sea of Marmara and out into the Eastern Mediterranean. They also charge, again, very small fees. So again, I don't know the exact numbers on those fees. I'll have to look them up. But the Iranians are also trying to charge what appear to be relatively small fees compared to, $45 billion a year, that's a lot of money in some capacity, but for a country, for the American taxpayer, that's like, that's a small bill passed by the U.S. Congress. That's like a 1% of the average omnibus, less than 1% of the average omnibus spending bill, passed in Congress. So that is the current situation. Dmitry, what do you think about the Strait of Hormuz? What do you think the final deal between Iran and Oman might look like? Do you think that the Americans are, influencing the Omanis? Obviously, the Omanis have collaborated somewhat in allowing this like alternate American route to exist through the strait. But while this has been going on, the Iranians have struck dozens of tankers attempting to pass through the Strait of Hormuz in the past 2 weeks. So I'd love your thoughts on the situation in the Persian Gulf as the key question of the strait is coming up. Because again, remember, this whole war started to destroy Iran's nuclear program, to decimate their missile capabilities, and to degrade their proxies. Also, with the cherry on top, really, of total regime change and the potential installation of, Reza Pahlavi, or turning the country, Israel, as they would prefer, into just another Libya, Syria failed state. But now America's fighting tooth and nail just to get the Strait of Hormuz opened at all, potentially even with under total Iranian control.
That's certainly the case. And even if you look at the timeline, there were these discussions, and you can see this published in Al Jazeera and Reuters this week, two fairly well-known publications, Reuters obviously being basically an ancient newspaper at this point. We recall Reuters was very active even during the early Russian revolutions, covering all of those events in a lot of detail, although exceptionally biased and, of course, pro-Western, liberal, Masonic, etc. But we need to just keep in mind it's been exactly like 53 days at this point, especially when the listeners are sort of listening to the program, since the 17th of June, Memorandum of Understanding signed, the Islamabad Agreement, as it's also called, signed in Versailles by Donald J. Trump, and of course Macron being present, etc. So that memorandum is almost entirely lost in terms of time frame, in terms of going outside of its boundaries, and yet they're still sort of discussing it as a point of recurrence. Like, we need to go back to this memorandum, and this is like the point of, this is something the Iranians could possibly maybe agree to again, with maybe some changes related to those Strait of Hormuz fees. And you have to just keep in mind, from the Iranian perspective, they do need some remedying of their financial circumstances. The Iranian rial at the moment is so heavily debased and hyperinflated. And yes, you may say, well, who cares if a currency inside of a nation, which is fiat anyway, it's not really based on silver or gold, it's fake money. It's just, who cares if it doesn't necessarily have any value as long as it functions within the country itself. But just keep in mind, if you're an Iranian citizen, good luck buying silver, gold, or Bitcoin with your Iranian rial. So it's completely, basically, the powers, shall we say, the individual's spending capacity, especially when it comes to purchasing any of these goods, which actually do store and hold value for long-term, and especially for, shall we say, like long-term economic engagements with overseas nations. So for the average Iranian, they've suffered a lot. A 5 to 7% fee, even if that's like the maximum that they could receive, would still not resolve their, of course, economic issues, at least in the short term. So this is, I think the Iranians are really asking for something incredibly reasonable here. Oman being maybe the major pusher of these negotiations in the Strait of Hormuz is quite interesting, because the MOU initially, it was basically a Pakistani project with Oman sort of taking the back seat. So in a way, we had Oman initiating the, shall we say, ceasefire discussions in the first phase after the beginning of the Purim War. Then you had Pakistan step in, and now you have Oman again taking the driver's position in the conferencing between the two countries. But as you said correctly, Conrad, it does seem like at some point it's either the US is having conversations one-on-one with Pakistan, and the Pakistanis are relaying the US's conditions to Iran, or it's, for example, Oman dealing unilaterally with the Iranians, and yet the US is seemingly not involved. Because I think the threats made by Trump over the last fortnight, the last sort of the bi-weekly claims that Trump will initiate the greatest battle that the US has been in since the Second World War. And that's, I think, taking into account, Vietnam, Korea, and all these other conflicts that the US has been, including, of course, the million personnel strong 2003 and the 1991 Iraq wars. And Trump claiming that he's going to start something larger than that in the coming days, which was the prediction of the previous weekend. And that's still sort of on the cards. I mean, it is incredibly concerning, and we have to just raise the query, like, can Oman actually handle such a potent negotiating partner with such major motivation behind them to actually push the conflict into an inevitable, I guess, military confrontation, which I think the Trump administration is aiming to bring the situation to. Unfortunately, I don't think the Trump administration, as you said, Conrad, has achieved pretty much any of its stated goals. There's no regime changes. There's no clarity on the nuclear dust, so to speak, nuclear centrifuges within Iran, the enrichment process. There's no necessary conditions that are forcing the Iranians to conduct themselves in one way or another. There's obviously China and Russia watching over the entire situation, providing basically unwarranted, at least from the U.S. perspective, commentary on the entire thing. It's entirely stressful on the Trump administration to actually get something done or pull out entirely from the entire conflict. And look, there are these sort of mounting questions as to what exactly are the U.S. losses to date in terms of hardware, in terms of personnel, servicemen loss, be it just your regular Marines or servicemen stationed in Jordan or some of these other bases in Syria that have recently been abandoned, or perhaps in Bahrain and Kuwait, members of CENTCOM, or perhaps even the covert CIA bases that there have been claims that have been apparently struck by the Iranians, which are, of course, these are major points of escalation that the U.S. hasn't really acted upon. And I think one of the reasons is because obviously those bases were covert to begin with, and they don't want to disclose that there was an actual base, and the Iranians have achieved something of potency. So I think at this point, Conrad, the U.S., the Trump administration is still in this predatory mode. They are still incredibly hawkish, and all this discussion about potentially getting a deal done, as you said, it's all chicanery. It's all basically preparation in order to bring more interceptors, more THAAD interceptors, more Patriot interceptors, missiles, Air Force units, and of course consolidate power perhaps within locations such as Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, and of course the Prince Sultan Air Base, which at this point, and as we'll discuss later on, given this new Mecca, the defense agreement will be, of course, a key location of U.S. power and CENTCOM, I think, primal command in the Middle East in order to carry out this Iranian operation, I think, in the near future. So we just have to keep in mind that none of the U.S. naval assets have left the Sea of Arabia. Yes, there are talks about a new ceasefire implementation. The Straits of Hormuz have been closed, and the prices of petrols are, of course, faltering around the world. There is some unsurety in the situation, but at the same time, there is this immense pressure on the U.S. to, of course, act. And just keep in mind, even if a new memorandum of understanding, some with edited points, will be introduced, this entire time for the last 52, 53 days, there has been an ongoing genocide in Lebanon between Hezbollah and Israel. So that is something the Iranians will not close their eyes upon, and they will request for Israel to, of course, leave. And we know that Netanyahu simply won't be doing that. Netanyahu has recently been to the White House, and those demands were not even placed upon him. So the Trump administration, again, I believe is in an incredibly aggressive attack phase. And all of this talk that, Trump is potentially going to seal the deal and leave the Middle East, and all these hopeful discussions, I think, are completely off the table for the Trump administration. He needs to save face before the midterms. That window of time is somewhat closing. It's and potentially the Republican Party, that particular vehicle of pushing his pro-Zionist agenda is going to lose a lot of steam after November, once, of course, the L's come in on the electoral ballots in all the various regions and states across the United States of America. So it's a very interesting and I think very tense period. The Iranians understand that they cannot trust any U.S. rhetoric. They've been backstabbed and betrayed before. And of course, diplomacy only means so little when you're dealing with basically a thief and a scoundrel, which is the Trump presidential administration at this point.
100%. And again, Ghalibaf, he's like talking tough, but his statement is ultimately meant to get the MOU kind of back on the table. Pezeshkian says similar things. And again, from my perspective, if I were an Iranian, I would be full IRGC, Ahmad Vahidi, bomb those ships in the Strait. I would not be wanting to be returning to the negotiating table. But again, at the same time, even though I'm of that persuasion from a strategic perspective, to me it seems clear that even at the negotiating table, the Americans are screwed here. Like you said, we're talking about the Strait of Hormuz even opening up at this point, and then we have to talk about nuclear. And we're not even close to nuclear, and then we're talking about opening the Strait of Hormuz. Iran also needs not only to the U.S. blockade of the Strait to end, but like you said, the war in Lebanon has to end. And again, Israel seems to be, they're advancing. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later. And Trump, like you mentioned, didn't seem to give any signals that he was going to be reining Netanyahu in. He gave Turkey some F-35s, but I think in Trump's strategic mind, he somehow thinks that he's going to get Turkey to use those F-35s against Iran or something. So we'll discuss that as well when we get to the Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia peace treaty. But of course, Dmitry, you mentioned the situation with the interceptors and the shortages. And this is from Reuters as well. It says Saudi Arabia used about 86% of its stockpiled 2,800 Patriot PAC-3 interceptors in the first 38 days of combat in the Iran war. After firing roughly 2,400 PAC-3s, the country was reportedly left with only 400 interceptors by April. Other Gulf nations used up similar amounts of their inventories. And again, we heard similar reports about America's shortages, whether it was our THAAD missiles or of our own Patriot interceptors. And again, Iran has been striking Iraqi Kurdistan with impunity. America has entirely pulled out of Iraq, including the base in Erbil. I don't know what kind of skeleton force remains, but all 5 Patriot missile interceptors that were present across Iraqi Kurdistan have also been pulled out. So the Kurds have just been facing, they're literally, no one is the Willem Dafoe meme, where he's looking up at the sky that everyone uses for missile strikes. That is Iraqi Kurdistan right now. The Kurds are just perpetually Willem Dafoeing it up right now because they have absolutely no American air defenses to protect them from what seems to be these daily strikes, especially in the Suleimaniye region, which is sort of the stronghold of the Kurdish militias that have been mobilized in the past and had been mobilized in the past months earlier this year against the Iranians. And of course, it says here from Middle East Spectator, the U.S. military has depleted nearly 80% of its THAAD missile interceptors in the war with Iran. This is sources, we're talking to CNN. The U.S. has also used up roughly half of its Patriot interceptor missiles, seriously limiting the capability to intercept Iranian ballistic missiles fired at Gulf states and Israel. The Pentagon has warned President Trump repeatedly in recent weeks that the low stockpiles could carry serious consequences in any new round of prolonged fighting with Iran. And again, are these stories being strategically leaked? Are they trying to, bait Iran into something? Who knows? But if that's true, it's a really deep bait because this is according to antiwar.com. President Trump on Thursday threatened leakers with jail time over reports about dwindling U.S. military stockpiles as a result of the Iran war and claimed that the U.S. had plenty of munitions available. The U.S. has massive amounts of munitions, especially of certain types. Additionally, large amounts are being manufactured and shipped to the U.S. as needed, Trump wrote on Truth Social. Defense companies are building the largest number of plants and factories in our country's history. The leakers of these treasonous statements are being hunted down, the president added. Some of the most significant reports about the shortage of advanced munitions didn't come from media reports, but from analyses published by the think tank, the Center for International Studies, CSIS, which used publicly available data to produce its estimates. CSIS found that the U.S. used about 60% of its advanced Patriot air defense missiles and about half of its interceptors for the THAAD missile defense system, though sources told CNN that the U.S. had actually used about 80% of its THAADs during the war. While Trump says the U.S. arms makers are working to produce more munitions, the current rate of weapons use far exceeds the rate at which they can be produced, and it will take years to significantly increase production. Media reports have also said that the U.S. has used up nearly all of its ATACMS missiles and precision strike missiles, which were both used extensively in strikes on Iran. And again, we've talked on this show before about specifically in Bahrain and Kuwait, Iran has struck many ATACMS and HIMARS and other both air defense and strike missiles that all the variety of everything that America is using, the radars that these systems all use, all of it has been struck by very precise Iranian strikes. It says Trump also responded to a report from the Washington Post that said he lashed out at U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth over the munition shortage, which one source told the outlet was part of the reason why Trump held off on his threats to dramatically escalate the war. Sources told the Post that on the sidelines of a recent cabinet meeting at Camp David, that Trump vented his frustration at Hegseth over the munition shortages. The report said that Hegseth then blamed his deputy, Stephen Feinberg, for both the shortages and for failing to ensure Trump was informed about the issue. Wow, really blaming the Jews, Hegseth. Now you want to blame the Jews. We're this deep we're 160 days into a Jewish war for Iran, and now you finally want to blame the Jewish guy that I'm sure was not influencing your decisions at all. The fake news, as usual, is spreading false and completely unfounded rumors. I'm extremely happy with the job that Pete Hegseth is doing, Trump wrote on Truth Social. He said that the Post published the report despite our telling them the story is completely false, and adding that he believes their fake reporting is treasonous. And again, one of the reasons that this shortage, I think ultimately it is real. The Americans did need a pause because the shortage had gotten so bad that specifically in Israel, and of course also American casualties were going to be experienced as well, and Israeli society would have been disrupted, and we've already lost trillions of dollars worth of equipment with these radars that have been struck by the Iranians across Kuwait, Jordan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, UAE. And again, we have new photos of Iranian missile debris. It says Iranian ballistic missiles for the first time are proven to have advanced anti-jamming capabilities and warheads being equipped with a four-element GNSS/GPS module for improved accuracy. I'm told by engineers that I know that this is the top of the line for missile GPS capabilities, and this is how they're so precise. This is how Iran is able to launch 3 missiles and they strike a hangar, a radar, and then one gets intercepted. That's why it's important to not do 90% interception, 99% interception. America has to be going for 100% interception rate because these are precise missiles. It says equipping the missiles with CRPA, controlled reception pattern antennas, explains the increase in accuracy and lethality of Iran's ballistic missiles in recent months. So that is part of why, again, not only have the Iranians been succeeding in hitting their strikes, but they've also scared the Americans and realized that all right, if we can't intercept the missiles, we're going to have to put a pause on the war because they're going to start hitting critical areas. And it shows you that there's nothing America can do to prevent the Iranian response. They have enough of these missiles and they're accurate enough to where in a single hour, Saudi Aramco, Qatari LNG, UAE production could all just be completely wiped off the map. And of course, the Houthis, the Yemenis have shown this in the past few weeks. And it's so much so that the United States, for the first time in its history, has reduced its Saudi Arabian crude imports to zero. As of July, for the first full month since 1985, the U.S. has not imported Saudi Arabian crude oil. This marks a sharp reversal from March, when U.S. refiners were purchasing more than 800,000 barrels of Saudi crude oil per day. This is from the Kobesi letter. It says here this comes as U.S. refiners sought alternative supplies after the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and broader Iran war-related disruptions pushed Middle Eastern crude prices higher. As a result, Venezuela has emerged as the primary replacement, with U.S. imports of its crude surging to around 600,000 barrels per day in July, up from just around 100,000 barrels per day at the start of the year. Global oil trade flows are undergoing a historic shift. And of course, we talked to Jose Nino about Delcy Rodriguez, the betrayal of Nicolas Maduro, and it's clear that Marco Rubio, the planners of the Venezuela operation, knew that this Iran war was coming. I'm sure Miriam Adelson filled him in. And so we secured Venezuela and its vast oil reserves so that we could easily replace Saudi Arabia, so that when, as it I think is inevitably coming, Iran destroys Saudi, UAE, Qatari energy, America can sustain itself and then slowly emerge actually as one of the other replacements, specifically for LNG. And of course, we not only get the Venezuelan oil, but we can also control its passage through the Panama Canal and prevent it entirely from reaching China. So of course, the overland trade from Iran to China is extremely important in this capacity. And in the midst of all of this, at least 3 tankers from the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company have been struck in this week alone. 15 of their tankers since the war started. So this is one of the major UAE oil exporters that are having some of their, the UAE, I think, faces the most tanker strikes if they're not facing the most strikes on their actual territories. So what are your thoughts on all of that, Dmitry, when it comes to, of course, America's missile shortage? How do you think they're going to be replenishing this? Do you think some of this is a bluff? How long do you think we have until America really renews its strikes? And again, this also means that if America starts striking again, they're definitely going to go for broke. I don't think there's a way that they can strike so hard where it actually prevents the Iranian response, but maybe the Israelis will trick them into trying something so crazy. And of course, the Saudi oil situation, again, the Aqaib oil production facility, the largest in the world, the largest in Saudi Aramco, was taken offline by the Houthis. And they said the earliest estimates were it'd be mid-August before it was back online. So again, people are thinking nothing's happening, thinking that we're in a ceasefire or whatever. There is no ceasefire. And The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait are closed to Saudi tankers. The only Saudi oil getting out is going to China. So again, we're still talking about that 5-6 weeks until early September, mid-September, when we're talking about those energy crunches and those shortages and the real kind of economic, tangible, on-the-ground consequences. And that timeline is still very much underway if something very dramatic as far as the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and deals doesn't happen here in the next few days.
Yeah, in relation to the shortage of interceptor missiles for Patriots, for THAADs, for other surface-to-air missile defense launches that the U.S. is experiencing, there's a lot of rumors going out. This Trump threat against whistleblowers from within the massive, of course, think about it, military-industrial complex, the Ministry of, it's not the MOD anymore, it's the MOW, Ministry of War. At this point, millions of staff members, so many jobs, so many people that can leak information. Trump's saying, look, there won't be any whistleblower protection. If anybody wants to be a Snowden like you are, you'll be going to jail, Guantanamo Bay for you. So Trump is making these sort of very hawkish, powerful threats. And of course, Pete Hegseth's on board. So of course, there probably won't be any protection. I would just say, like, if you're a Minister of Defense, Minister of War member trying to leak information, I'd just be preparing to leave the United States of America or its territories because, I think the Trump administration, in its wartime footing, you may be, in fact, subjected to, let's just say, less than humane treatment in custody if you are, of course, arrested. So just keep in mind, I think the Trump administration is in this incredibly aggressive state right now. And there is certainly, I think, a shortage ongoing. This is just my speculation, given that we do see Russian missile strike launches hitting almost with 100% success rates in the Ukraine, around Kiev, Kharkiv, any other cities the Russians are aiming to strike at, Odessa, western Ukraine, with their Kinzhals, their Iskanders, and of course even their hypersonic missiles, which no doubt would probably bypass Patriot missile defenses anyway. The Zircon missiles, there have been reports that the Russians have been using their high-end, state-of-the-art Zircon missile systems, which are basically like missile computers. Those things are so high-end and incredibly fast, very, very potent. And the Russians have been basically pinpoint striking across Ukraine this week, and the Ukrainians have not been able to shoot these missiles down. Zelensky has been complaining about this for weeks now, about, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks at this point, to the US, saying that we need more interceptors. Can we build some Patriot interceptor factories in Ukraine? Firstly, if you build a Patriot factory, you bring in US, specialists, right, either from private or administrative defense workers into the Ukraine, what's going to happen is that factory is going to be struck by the Russians, and the Russians have made no qualms about actually striking these facilities. I mean, we all speculate about the death of Lindsey Graham. What exactly was he doing in the drone factory, and where did he meet his death? Was it at home in the United States, or was it, for example, maybe visiting one of these covert facilities that produced weapons? So the Russians have basically said that, look, if you're within the vicinity of any weapons industrial production plant within the Ukraine, you are basically a valid target. And so very, very dangerous, even contemplating sending in Patriot missile interceptor builders or anything like that, even U.S. citizens to the Ukraine to conduct that sort of work. And the Trump has basically denied. He said, look, the Ukraine has enough interceptor missiles. He says that the Ukraine is fine, in fact. So Trump has made it very clear this week that the Ukraine is not going to get any more than it is receiving at the moment. And so he's saying basically Zelensky is bluffing. And look, this almost points to the fact that there is the reality of the fact is there is pressure, obviously, on the Russian Federation through the sanctions, through the constant harassment, the green lighting, as Marco Rubio has pointed out, the green lighting of the deep Ukrainian strikes into the territory of the Russian Federation, specifically its European parts west of the Ural Mountains. That has all been greenlit by the U.S. administration, most certainly, right? But there's also been ongoing pressure on the Zelensky Ukrainian regime to either wrap things up or to bring the war to a certain point that the Putin administration would, of course, sign on to some sort of ceasefire deal. And again, the U.S. no doubt has been dangling the carrot before Vladimir Putin as well, sort of claiming that, look, if you just stop supporting Iran, we'll bring the situation to a ceasefire. There's probably all kinds of covert negotiations going on behind the scenes. It was speculated before that if Russia potentially betrays Ukraine, the Ukraine will give major concessions and things like that. But we haven't really seen the Kremlin move towards those positions yet. And so it is. I think the reality of the fact is there is a shortage of these interceptor missiles. There's a limited number of places all of these interceptor missiles can be stored at once. These are, by the way, the arms depots for these interceptor missiles as well are incredibly valid targets for both Iran and the Russians, be it in Ukraine, Israel, Jordan, wherever they are located. Those particular locations need to be protected themselves. So it's, I think, an incredibly potent question. And of course, why we say this is because the major advantage the Iranians have, militarily speaking, obviously isn't their navy. It isn't even their ground army, which no doubt is well trained and etc. But there's been ground armies stronger in the Middle East in the past. I think one of the main advantages that Iran does have is this insane ballistic missile parity advantage, basically, that they can just simply overwhelm any one of their opponents within 500, 600-mile radius, as well as with these long-range drones, and they can overcome most surface-to-air missile defense systems, including the Iron Dome in Israel. So the only way to defend against that is through these interceptors, which, again, the US is apparently the major supplier of, and you don't hear anything about the Turks providing any missile defenses to any of these American bases, etc. Everyone's quite selfish with their local interceptors, so the US is this main provider, and there's no doubt that it's, of course, being stretched and exhausted to the limit here. So, and the thing I wanted to point out about Saudi Arabia, obviously, is this is really big news. Saudi Arabians are facing immense pressure from Ansar Allah and the Houthis, and correctly pointed out, Conrad, the east-west crude oil pipeline that traveling from Abqaiq, located on the Persian Gulf, a very telling name, and of course to Yanbu on the Red Sea. That particular 1,200-kilometer pipeline is the only way the Saudi Arabians can reliably basically export that crude oil to the rest of the world, primarily China. And at the moment, I think that pipeline, and this is why the Saudi Arabians no doubt are pressuring the US to, like, look, we need to secure this pipeline. If the Iranians strike it, if the Iranians take this pipeline down, Saudi Arabia, one of the greatest oil exporters in the world, will be, of course, taken offline, at least temporarily, and that will be, of course, a huge strike. And the oil pipelines that have existed in the past that travel from Saudi Arabia north through Iraq to Syria and all these other pipelines, they're simply not as functional at all. They're not reliable. And I believe the Syria-Iraq pipeline is actually completely offline and has been since the 1950s, and it's going to take a decade to rebuild it. So there is no alternative. It's either the Straits of Hormuz are opened, or it's this east-west crude oil pipeline from Abqaiq to Yanbu. It needs to remain open. And of course, it is well within range of the Iranian missile systems. And so this particular local conflict that's happening right now, which appears to be bilateral between the Saudis, the Saudi-backed forces in Yemen, and of course the Ansar Allah Houthis at Absana and Al-Hudaydah, this particular conflict basically places the entire Saudi Arabian military on high alert, because they threaten basically the livelihood and the entire message of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That is to say that our kingdom is the safe haven for Sunni Muslims around the world. We are this rich, prosperous, we are blessed by Allah. We have, basically we are the heart of the Muslim world, and we're entirely not just self-sufficient, but we also provide this energy to the entire world. Not only do we spread Salafism and Wahhabism, but we also spread, the black blood, the oil, as one of the sort of esoteric writers of Iran described oil of the Middle East as like the black blood of these chthonic ancient titans that are buried deep under the ground in the Middle East. I mean, this is some really esoteric type stuff, but basically, yeah, they do supply the entire world, and this particular PR image is going to be entirely shattered by this rogue group. It's almost like a Star Warsian scenario that's ongoing, and of course, the Yemeni Houthis have shown since 2014 and 2015 that they can actually take on the entire official military of the Saudis and their allies in Yemen. And I think the casualty rates this week have been, astounding. We've commented off air, Conrad, that potentially the Yemeni Houthis have, in fact, killed in battle more Saudi Arabian and Saudi Arabian-backed troops than Iran has taken out U.S. servicemen and their allies over the last few months, which is, staggering numbers. So the Yemeni Houthis are, of course, applying pressure. And all of this started, you can say, applying pressure to Saudi Arabia. All of this commenced because it was the Saudi Arabians that have elected to stop this Iranian plane that was coming home from the morning of Ali Khamenei's funeral and all that grieving period to the Sana'a airport. I mean, it's absolutely the dumbest pretext ever. In fact, we were expecting the Ansar Allah Houthis to become involved over maybe a reignited, very sort of aggressive genocide of the Palestinians by the Israelis. That was one scenario. The second scenario was obviously the striking of civilian power plants, desalination plants, and civilian targets within Iran, which the Houthis promised. If that would happen, the Iranians would ask the Ansar Allah Houthis to come out on their side and, of course, close the Bab el-Mandeb. But now the Saudis have essentially provoked the Ansar Allah Houthis even ahead of time, which I think was a very silly decision. Or perhaps it was, who knows, maybe in the long term it was calculated to sort of try to bring the Houthis into action early on and then to maybe distract them from the Bab el-Mandeb. We will just have to see all of this. But the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is, of course, under immense pressure at the moment because they're fighting an enemy that they fought before and that they have proven they could not defeat in open combat. And we've seen much smaller forces, of course, defeat stronger ones, be it the Donbass rebels defeating the entire army of Ukraine back during the Donbass Civil War, or be it the Talibanis in Afghanistan, of course, basically fighting off the entire Western democratic coalition and, of course, so to speak, liberating their country in a Sharia law type sense from the so-called Western Crusaders and Zionists. So it's all very curious, and we've seen this sort of scenarios play out before, and Saudi Arabia is in a world of hurt at this point.
Most definitely. And just to make it very clear to people, in the past 36 hours, and as of me reading this, this is actually in the past 36 hours. Maybe it'll be more like 48, 60 plus hours by the time you're listening to this on Sunday. But in the past 36 hours, Ansar Allah have struck a Saudi tanker in the Red Sea, forced a second tanker to reverse course in the Gulf of Aden, attacked 3 military bases in Yemen's Hadramaut Governorate. That's the attack that assaulted the Saudi proxy forces, that killed 45 personnel. That's actually over 50 as of the time of this recording. They struck Saudi Arabia's Najran International Airport, injuring 11 people and destroying the facility's main radar system, targeting Sayyun International Airport in the Hadramaut region in eastern Yemen, and they struck 2 military bases in central Yemen's Marib Governorate, also where Saudi-backed forces were amassing. Apparently, there's 35,000 plus Wahhabi Saudi-supported forces that are continuing to gather on the border, trying to assault and make incursions into Ansar Allah-controlled territory. So again, the Houthis are they're off the leash. They're fighting the fight. Again, they're technically not internationally recognized by almost anyone as the official authorities over Yemen, yet they control the vast majority of the population, and they clearly are militarily intimidating Saudi Arabia. All of those things have occurred. Saudi Arabia has yet to respond, and of course, they're afraid they don't want to respond because they're afraid. This is all in retaliation to the Saudis striking the airport, and even technically the initial pretext for striking the Aqaib oil facilities and whatnot was some kind of Saudi reconnaissance drone that was shot down over Yemen. It's probably happening all the time. So they were just looking for a reason to get in and start to do this. And one of the reasons as well why, again, the capabilities of the missiles that they have, apparently IRGC shipments to the Houthis have still been able to be maintained in some capacity. Of course, they also are likely the ones that were behind the strikes on the American oil facilities near the Suez Canal, right there at the entrance on the Mediterranean Egyptian coast, to send the message that, look, we're closing the Bab el-Mandeb Straits right now, and we're letting Chinese ships pass through, and some of these Saudi ships are turning around and going through the Suez Canal and going around Africa or going the other way, but ultimately we can shut that down as well. That's, the message that's being sent. And again, that's a powerful, force projection that they have there from their little section of Yemen. So it's no wonder that the Saudis are afraid of them. And for that very reason, it's why for the initial strikes on the oil capabilities, Saudi Arabia blamed the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Force militias, the Iranian-backed militias there, because they thought they would be an easier target that wouldn't retaliate against them. But initially, they were also wrong. Of course, the U.S. and the Saudis struck Iraq. I think we covered it last week, or if not, I covered it on my live stream. They killed, I think, 5 to 6 IRGC operators that were also functioning and working with the Axis of Resistance Iraqi militias. And then they lost several dozen other operators, and they pledged to retaliate. But of course, it was just today that, following pressure from the Iraqi government, and of course, the Iraqi government was being heavily pressured by Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries, government and Badr organization leader, who's one of the main Iranian kind of ally leader organizations, Hadi al-Ameri, said the Islamic resistance in Iraq announces it is postponing the retaliation against Saudi Arabia, which was planned for today. And that is, of course, August 7th when this is being read. And of course, one of the reasons why is this happening? Why did they delay this? Well, what also happened today, sort of out of nowhere, it had only recently been talked about. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan have pledged mutual defense as Middle East turmoil escalates. This is from Reuters reporting, but they signed this deal. If one country attacks the other, Turkey and Pakistan will be, in this case, of course, Saudi Arabia is in focus. Turkey and Pakistan, nuclear-armed Pakistan, NATO-aligned Turkey will be forced to respond. So, of course, these Iraqi militias seem to have paused in the midst of that. So it appears that the Yemeni strikes, these Iraqi response, had scared everybody so much of the destruction of Saudi Arabian energy that they made sure that this, I'm sure what was in the works for a broader, signing and more fanfare, Americans were like, look, get that draft on the table and let's sign it, then we can maybe stop this response. And the Iraqi militias seem to have heeded the call. But of course, the obvious question is, when Iran does attack these countries, how is this going to play into it? But I guess we can discuss all of that, but I'd also love your thoughts, of course, on the Houthis in Yemen, Dmitry, everything that they've been doing. Of course, the civil war in Yemen is going on. There's multiple fronts on the ground where they're fighting it seems to be more and more aligning Presidential Transition Council and Southern Transition Council forces, the Saudi and UAE-backed forces, respectively, merging into one to confront Ansar Allah, who seem to be undoubtedly the real, force operating on the end of the Arabian Peninsula there. So before we get into this crazy treaty between Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, what do you think about our boys, the Houthis?
No, I think the Houthis obviously are not recognized by any of the BRICS countries, actually. So the so-called allies of the Axis of Resistance. We just need to point that out. So the Russians diplomatically do, in fact, support the official government of Yemen, internationally supported by the Saudi Arabians, etc. There's this weird relationship between the Russians and the GCC countries. The Russians have this warm relationship with the UAE, which is in opposition to Iran. They have they've almost, I think for the first half of this year, they've had a visa-less regime with Saudi Arabia for whatever reason. Very bizarre, again, relations, which again doesn't really strike me as the Russians being strongly behind the Houthis. But in fact, the Yemenis Houthis themselves, they of course are not despairing, despite the fact that they do not have any sort of international support besides their local allies in Iran, Hezbollah, the Iraqi militant groups, and those, of course, who understand the issues of Zionism and their allies in the Middle East. Of course, the Houthis, in fact, have this almost Orthodox Christian parallel. They understand the threats coming in the Middle East, and they know which countries are causing the issues in their particular region and how peace can be achieved essentially from subduing the predatory beasts that are, of course, not just the GCC countries, but of course the main culprits, the Israelis, which are operating and sort of pushing this entire aggressive various theaters of war, basically frustrating the situation for many nations at once. I do want to mention the lightweight capabilities of the Houthis as well. We see them, they obviously have their Toyota trucks. They don't have pretty much any tanks. There are some armored vehicles, but they're of course of little use. It's very mobile forces, a lot of motorcycles, very similar to the Sahel style combat that the Tuaregs and Janim are carrying. And I'm not making any sort of ideological analogies between, of course, Black African
There's
ISIS.
a lot of motorcycles in Russia, Ukraine as well. Let's not.
True, that's right. And there's horses, there's electric scooters as well, which are very quiet. So, of course, the Houthis, they don't have the electric scooters that are operating in Eastern Europe, but and of course they are using those manpads, which are those shoulder-mounted heat-seeking missiles, which can, again, you don't have S-300s, S-400 systems, but they're using the Hezbollah-style manpads, which again the Ukrainians have utilized again in the early periods of the special military operation. They are just as effective at taking out Reaper drones and other things. In fact, the Houthis at the moment are sort of in a way tied with the Iranians for most amount of Reaper drones taken out, and so they are incredibly potent. But of course, we can't, for example, expect the Houthis to mount this sort of ground operation to take Riyadh or to liberate Mecca for the Islamic world. I think that's somewhat unrealistic. But in order to defend their own land in a guerrilla style warfare, maybe it's very similar to how the North Vietnamese defeated the Americans, the Taliban defeated the coalitionary intervention forces, or maybe something akin to the Cuban militiamen who defeated, of course, we're talking about Fidel Castro and friends, the communists. The Houthis do have sort of some great examples in history to sort of fall back on, despite the fact that they do not have, obviously, an air force either. There's no helicopters. Maybe they have one or two helicopters at certain airports, but they're obviously hidden and masqueraded quite well. So there's some absence of advantage here, but I think drones do bring that parity a little bit closer with their opposition, specifically when it comes to either mining the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb or perhaps putting them at risk and maybe dropping off some of those complex mines that no doubt the Iranians have supplied them with ahead of time in order to prepare for some sort of conflict within the Middle East with the GCC states, probably in periods past. And no doubt about that, the Houthis do have some long-range drone capabilities, which, again, the drones are basically improved with almost every single quarter of every year. So the drones the Ukrainians have are no doubt much better than the drones that the Houthis have at the moment, but it doesn't make them any less effective. And if you look at the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, that's a very long stretch. There's a big question as to if the Saudi Arabians can actually defend that long stretch of border and the 1.2 thousand kilometer east-west pipeline. I mean, that is just absolutely a prime target if the Houthis would really want to hurt Saudi Arabia for forcing these incursions into their territory and pushing for an aggressive war, basically committing genocide against the Yemeni Arabs. Then, of course, they can always carry out those strikes. But I do want to mention one thing, though. There is just like a covert a potential as well that the Israelis do have. Yemen was well known for having certain Yemenis Talmudic tribe members. So Yemenis Jews are, of course, like a major migrant group within Israel. So there is a potential of infiltration, or at least in the long term. There's no doubt there are Mossad agents around Sana'a, al-Hudaydah, similar to how Mossad has infiltrated communities within Gaza, Palestine, and of course, no doubt Iran has shown recently there's like an abundance of either Sayanim or directly Mossad spies. So there are literally Israelis who look identical to Arab Ansar Allah Houthis, like physically, physiognomy-wise, and no doubt they're also circumcised, so you can't really like pull down the pants and tell what's going on there. But it's technically, there is that threat. It's ever existing. Unfortunately, in the Muslim world, we have seen the Israelis plan decade-long operations against their adversaries. The pager operation against Hezbollah has been an example. So the Houthis do need to, I think Ansarullah needs to be aware that, look, they potentially have multiple enemies, and it's not just the Saudis. Potentially there's more to come from the coming escalations in the Bab el-Mandeb conflict zone.
Undoubtedly, and it's clear that that's why this new defense pact between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan was hastily put together so quickly. This is from Reuters. It says the Mecca Joint Defense Agreement is intended to strengthen collective deterrence against any act of aggression and stipulates that an armed attack against any of the three would be regarded as an attack on all, they said in a joint statement. However, the statement did not give specifics on the commitments each had accepted, and it was not clear how far their agreement would bind them to any particular military action in each other's defense. Turkish Vice President Cevdet Yilmaz said the agreement was not aimed at any specific country, and that a Turkish official had also added that it was precisely defensive and did not abrogate any existing agreements the countries had with other states. The three nations share concerns about the increasingly aggressive military stances of both Israel and revolutionary Shiite Iran as their longtime U.S. ally struggles to contain regional upheaval that has caused a global energy crisis. And of course, these are three Sunni states. I know many countries are afraid to criticize Saudi Arabia, other Sunni countries, especially even American, people that are Muslims are afraid to criticize Saudi Arabia despite it being, one of the most Shabbos Goy-esque states, because Saudi Arabia has the possibility to ban you from Mecca, to ban you from the holy city, to ban you from Medina, these places. So, Saudi Arabia gets away with a lot because they are the custodians of, the freaking cube. But ultimately, these Sunni countries have come together. Again, Pakistan, small Shia minority, Turkey, Sunni country, of course, and of course, Saudi Arabia, the main, progenitor of Wahhabist radical Sunni Islam. And to me, this makes perfect sense why the Iranians would rather deal with the Omanis as their main mediator instead of, Pakistan. Look, Pakistan has nukes. They're the most relevant party to bring in to these kind of defense agreements. Turkey, of course, largest military in the region outside of, the Iranians themselves. They, of course, also host American nuclear weapons and are, of course, in NATO. So really, besides Iran itself, Turkey and Pakistan are the two most relevant Islamic countries that Saudi Arabia, who has clearly proven itself to be, despite needing air defense and the ability to defend itself the most and project power, is completely incapable of doing that. They can't even project power directly south of their border into Yemen. They can't protect the most vital, most relevant, most highly fuel processing plants in the world with their current air defense capabilities. So they've had to bring in Turkey and Pakistan and basically the threat of those two large military powers to prevent, again, sub-state Iraqi militias from destroying Saudi Arabian oil capabilities in a retaliation for an attack that they only did because they didn't want to actually attack the people that actually attacked them, which was the Houthis, who they're also afraid of attacking them, who I guess in theory, Turkey and Pakistan may get roped into attacking the Yemeni Houthis as well. And of course, Turkish forces, Saudi forces, and I don't know about Pakistani forces, but have also, again, in the Red Sea, they've been present with the war going on in Sudan. So there's all sorts of different ways in which they could play out. But Abbas Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, he responded to the Turkey-Saudi-Pakistani alliance. He said, Iran's powerful armed forces have shown their readiness, capability, and might in face of the world's most expensive military. When Muslims stand together, we can face every challenge by malicious outsiders head on. Time to rely only on ourselves and embrace true brotherhood. And it's like, my man, I hate to break it to you, but they did, piece that together largely to defend against you. But at the same time, it is evidence that the United States is effectively incapable of defending countries in the Middle East, and that the Middle East, these countries, they might as well come together themselves. But again, the real reason that this was hastily thrown together is because, as I read in the Reuters article, there's basically no specifics. So whatever really happens outside of some kind of, I guess, land invasion of Saudi Arabia, which obviously isn't happening, it seems like Turkey and Pakistan can basically say, oh, well, we don't have to get involved in this. But again, this is just another example as to why the Iranians are clearly much more happy to deal with their Ibadi, non-Sunni Omani brethren, as opposed to, frankly, from my perspective, the traitorous Shabbos Goyim of the Sunni Ummah.
Certainly, and there's some interesting factors. These three major nations, I think the only Sunni Muslim majority nation that isn't included that could be considered a regional power is probably Egypt, with a very powerful, potent sort of ground army. And Egypt, of course, has been on the payroll for, I think, for so long that many consider that particular military junta that's taken over that country as somewhat incapable of, making independent decisions, or at least they're they've been very subtle, at least since the losses to Israel in the wars of the 20th century. So Israel has been somewhat dominant in that relationship. But the Turks, the Saudi Arabians have shown some sort of, at least, impetus for independent thinking, at least in recent periods. Saudi Arabians being unsuccessful in Yemen, but having been successful in the construction of the Syrian homunculi, right? The Syrian homunculus, the golem, the klipot, the sort of Talmudic creature that is this new Damascus HTS regime. That is actually the public servants in Damascus are being co-funded. Their salaries are being paid from Saudi Arabia and from the coffers of Qatar, and I believe the UAE is also involved in that. So just keep that in mind. Like, that's how depleted the treasuries are within Syria itself. So the military is controlled by the Turks. The money is coming from the GCC states. It's like a joint project. And that's probably where the first collaborations really between the Saudis and the Turks really came in. It was on the Syrian issue. So the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime almost, brings, it's like Arnold Schwarzenegger and the black actor from Predator shaking hands. Like, that is the connection point. It is the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And you recall that very dramatic meeting in May of 2023 when Bashar al-Assad, right before, a year and a half before the regime unfortunately fell in Syria, he did visit Saudi Arabia for the Arab Summit. And there was the fact that he gave that, when he was about to give his speech, the president of Syria, Erdogan walked out of the room. It's super symbolic. I mean, that's almost, very dramatic. There'll be movies filmed about this in the future, but that particular movie just showed that there's this sort of coalition between the powerful Sunni Muslim countries has been building for quite some time. No doubt they've been planning it, and no doubt there is a point of green lighting that came from the Trump administration as well. Yes, this does counter-signal the entire Abraham Accords angle a little bit, but we have to keep in mind there are, so to speak, Turkic countries in the past that have somewhat, have already signed on to the Abraham Accords, for example, Kazakhstan, right, which is so strange. And I think Turkmenistan, no doubt, is not long behind, and Azerbaijan as well. So there's this really weird sort of move to have Abraham Accords are not a defense pact either. So it's more of a networking, economic, peacetime sort of humanitarian agreement. Whereas this particular defense pact, I think, has major implications. There's so many angles. We could almost have a show specifically on this particular issue, the implications of it. We've spoken in the past, Conrad, about the connection between Pakistan, the fact that Iran should not trust Pakistan entirely because Pakistan's two greatest allies, we've expressly mentioned it on the show, are Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And they've made it clear multiple times. And Prime Minister Sharif and all the signaling that, Pakistan is, concerned about Iran. Pakistan mostly just wants to make sure that Balochistan and all these areas west of their borders are more or less secured and the country of Iran doesn't fall apart into little pieces and gives rise to new formations of ISIS or the Taliban or these sort of paramilitary movements that could cause problems and instability within Pakistan itself. I think Pakistan doesn't want Iran to collapse entirely. However, Pakistan is well and truly not on the, so to speak, they're not necessarily fence-sitting, and nor are they in the camp of Iran. I think long-term they are part of that larger Sunni Islamic Ummah coalition, whatever you may call that, as unsuccessful as they have been. But they have been successful in one thing, and that is the destruction of Syria, and of course the solidification of that sort of Wahhabi Salafi movements, and sort of move towards maybe a new Muslim Brotherhood type of union between all of these countries. The other interesting concept I think listeners would find quite curious is we've spoken a lot about how the prophecies in the future do foretell of Turkey essentially completely getting off the plantation and sort of derailing themselves, taking a very hawkish, aggressive position towards Greece, towards Russia, and possibly even, countries of the south, maybe even Israel, but specifically under the new Kemalist regime that will come in after Erdogan's untimely demise. Now, what's curious is perhaps this defense pact is like Erdogan's basically child. It is his Sunni Muslim view that, the Sunni Muslim world should be united. It's his link between Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood. It is very much an Erdogan-esque neo-Ottoman project, whereas the new Kemalist regime that will come to power, no doubt, will probably maybe completely disregard this defense pact and its sort of Article 5 NATO-esque, precautionary built-in clauses that will, provide them with mutual defense against their neighbors. There is obviously, again, this pressure that the US no doubt is trying to put on the Turks to get involved with the Iranian conflict. I think the Iranians really do not want to engage Turkey at all. Turkey does have a very potent military industrial complex. They have a very powerful army. And of course, there is a lot of history, but just as there have been many wars, just over 10, 11, 12 wars between Russia and Turkey, there are also many, many wars between the Shia Persians and the Sunni Muslim Ottoman Caliphate that have happened over past centuries. So these are two countries, civilizations that have been in conflict for many, many times, specifically over countries such as Azerbaijan, Armenia, and on those borders they've been fighting for a very long time. And in fact, the Turks in the past, the Turkmens, just like the Mongols before them, they have in fact conquered Iran at least on one occasion. And this is why, of course, Iran does have a large ethnically Turkic population. It's because, look, they didn't invite the Turks, and the Turks came by force and conquered the entire Iranian plateau in the past. So there is this interesting caution that the Iranians, I think, correctly have about Turkey, and that's why they want to keep them more or less at arm's length, but not to necessarily agitate Erdogan and whatever. This is probably why, again, the rhetoric about Erdogan's involvement and the Turkish involvement in the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime, as painful as that was for Iran, Iran didn't necessarily agitate the Turks too much over it. They didn't get too triggered because Turkey is this major regional power that, of course, the Iranians simply do not want to agitate at this point. They don't want to provoke them. They want to stay sort of on their good side. And who knows, maybe this also, Conrad, this new Mecca defense agreement will also solidify Saudi Arabia, this kingdom, the Prince Sultan Air Base outside of Riyadh, as one of the only safe zones for U.S. personnel, despite the fact that there are less CENTCOM personnel in the Prince Sultan base and across Saudi Arabia, at least on paper, like in terms of permanently stationed. There are less troops and servicemen on the ground than in Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. So technically, Saudi Arabia is like the minority partner, but Saudi Arabia does have these bases, where potentially you do have that 101st Marine Expeditionary Corps station somewhere in Saudi Arabia. That's just my theory. Potentially the 82nd Airborne Division as well is stationed there, maybe in the desert somewhere in locations undisclosed. So Saudi Arabia, in a way, becomes the safe zone for CENTCOM, where essentially they will become insulated against Iranian long-range ballistic strikes. But I think that'll become clear in the next week or so. If Iran strikes out against Saudi Arabia, we will see if Pakistan and Turkey will respond, and if this agreement actually holds any weight at all, or if it's just another, false diplomatic hot air exercise where, it's just a rhetorical tool in order to bring the Ummah together. But again, just like the issues over Palestine, the Ummah did not respond at all to the genocide of over 100,000 Palestinian Sunni Muslims. So perhaps this is just another one of those dud blank situations.
Yeah, again, and there's no real details. It seems it's not as heshed out as something like NATO Article 5, which, it has, sub clauses and committees that will meet when things are triggered and whatnot. I think this was something that was in the works. It was, Turkey was sort of meant to join the Saudi Arabia-Pakistan pact that already existed, and they expedited this because it frankly seemed that Saudi Arabia was about to be under imminent attack by axis of resistance groups, not even Iran itself at this current stage, which again, we all know is why the Americans are holding back, as well as, of course, the shortages of missile interceptors that we discussed earlier. So you talked about Syria as well, Dmitry, and of course, the Israelis have advanced into Dara province in Syria, in the south there, in the regions that they continue to occupy, despite the fact that, again, the Syrian government has said that they need a full Israeli withdrawal. Iran has said that they need Syria to withdraw. America has wanted Syria to withdraw, wanted Israel to withdraw from Syria. But ultimately, Israel, not only are they advancing in Syria, but they're advancing in Lebanon as well, despite the multiple, between the Memorandum of Understanding and the deal they made with Lebanon, between Israel with the Joseph Aoun government, and what Trump has said to them. They've only pulled out, and it was even partially, not fully, out of one of the pilot zones. And despite all of this, they have issued evacuation orders in the town of Mansouri, and they have struck all across southern Lebanon. 8 wounded overnight. This was as of August 6th. Some of the highest rates of casualties since June. This is from Jason Ditz at Anti-War. It says, while the U.S. brokered Israel-Lebanon talks didn't actually wrap up until Thursday, Israel was already scaling the war back up substantially on Wednesday, giving the impression that the relative reduction in violence of recent weeks is coming to an end. On Wednesday, Israel fired 113 projectiles into Lebanon, the most strikes launched in a single day since mid-June, according to UNIFIL peacekeepers. 1 person was killed and 11 wounded in a daytime attack on Tebnin, and the attacks continued into the night. Overnight strikes against the Tyre district of Burj al-Shamali wounded at least 8 more people. The attacks involved 3 distinct drone strikes, followed up by an airstrike by an Israeli warplane. Further airstrikes and artillery strikes were reported against Mansouri, Majd al-Zun, and the Al-Hamra area, although no casualties were reported. Again, Israel issued an evacuation order for Mansouri on Wednesday after complaining that locals had attempted to return to their homes there. Reports in the Israeli media suggested Israel is considering another substantial military escalation in Lebanon, though that has not yet been confirmed. Wednesday's salvos also suggest that strategy may already be partially underway. This week's U.S. brokered talks adjourned apparently without any new agreements, and a preliminary date of September 1st has been set for the next talks, meaning there is effectively no diplomatic obstacle standing in the way of more escalations in the next several weeks. This obviously, completely vindicates Hezbollah, who said that what we view as the best possibility for a true ceasefire in Lebanon and Israeli withdrawal is Iranian sort of negotiated demand to the Americans to enforce it, not a deal between the Lebanese government and the Israeli government. The Lebanese government doesn't even recognize the existence of Israel. So how are you going to negotiate with them? So you need to get them out of your country, which means, frankly, you need to support the resistance. And if you're not going to support the resistance, then you need to support the Iranian mandate and the, frankly, forward momentum. And frankly, they're winning right now the war, so they have the ability to dictate terms. And one of those terms is Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon. And that is going to be a lot more effective than whatever nonsense Joseph Ayoun comes up with. But of course, it isn't just Lebanon. There was an attack on family homes in the Al-Susi Tower in Gaza City. At least 18 Palestinians were killed. Many people have been killed and wounded across Palestine in recent weeks, despite the fact that Trump is talking about new revelations from the Board of Peace and about how there's going to be a new base set up in Gaza that will house 150 people and Moroccan peacekeepers. So, shocker, who will be allowed into Gaza and Israel? The Moroccans, who just invaded Spain and basically did Israel's bidding to punish a member of the European Union who was anti-Zionist. Be sure, again, to listen to our Ether Hour episode with Jose Nino. We go into full detail about the background, why Spain was doing this, the history of anti-Zionism in Spain, of course, the Moroccan angle, their Israeli control, and why the U.S. and Israel facilitated the migrant invasion of the Ceuta city in North Africa, which is, of course, Spanish territory. So be sure to check all of that out. But it is apparently Moroccan troops. It literally is supposed to be Moroccan and Azerbaijani troops that will eventually enter Gaza, which you just can't make it up. It's just the true Shabbos Goyim are being deployed to set up this new, smart technocratic city, I guess, on the coast of Palestinian Eastern Mediterranean. So with all of that, Dmitry, I would love your perspective on what's going on in Palestine, what's going on in Lebanon, what's going on in Syria, because it's clear that the Greater Israel Project continues to ramp up. And despite the fact that Trump is desperately trying to give Iran what they want, allow them to open the Straits, and somehow try to move on to the nuclear file, the Zionists are just doing their thing to expand Greater Israel, pretty much regardless of what else is happening.
Yeah, all of the rhetoric and pressure by the Israelis on the Turks recently, all the anti-Turkish rhetoric that has been arising, perhaps there is, shall we say, covert discussions going on behind the scenes where the Turks, through their connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, through their link with Qatar, again, with that, Turkey being basically a new home base for the Hamas diplomatic corps, and perhaps they are trying to apply some pressure on Hamas within the Gaza Strip in order to, again, take this very path of like, well, look, the position is the Israelis leave the Gaza Strip. This is the current Hamas position, and Hamas will disarm, which again, very unlikely that the Israelis will agree to something like this, but potentially there is pressure being put on them, just as there is pressure in relation to the Iranian issue from the Chinese, from the Pakistanis, potentially even from the Russian Federation on the Iranians to subject themselves to the will of Donald J. Trump, to open up the Straits of Hormuz, to sort of consolidate and to ease out the economic situation in the Middle East, but which the Iranians are, of course, not agreeing with. They're, of course, taking a very patriotic, sovereign position, which probably is the correct one. However, in the Gaza situation, I think all the Palestinian people simply do want to stop the hot or even the soft form of genocide from taking place and actually rebuild, bury their dead, have a grieving period after the events of October 7th and the ongoing genocide that of course that they encountered and that was forced upon them. I do want to also point out that as soon as there is, of course, a lasting peace established between the Palestinians and the IDF, the Israelis, at least for a period of time, there will, of course, be these calls from the international community to investigate the events of October 7th, there could be major implications for the Likud party, for Netanyahu, etc. At least there'll be some sort of pressure, and there'll be maybe even local journalists coming into the Gaza Strip once, of course, all the forces withdraw. There's basically a lot of positive aspects that could come out of the entire process. But we do understand that inevitably in 5 to 10 years, the Israelis will be back, and a disarmed Hamas will, of course, be entirely dislodged from the Gaza Strip. So Hamas disarming essentially means Hamas will need to leave, and probably they need to also prepare themselves for a certain exodus if they do sign on to any sort of disarmament agreement. But at this point, there is obviously still a soft genocide ongoing. It hasn't necessarily stopped. The Israelis control the majority of the Gaza Strip, at least 60% of it plus. So, and that yellow line is going to be softly expanding further and further and putting immense pressure on the local Palestinian people, in addition to all the other trauma and grief that they've suffered recently. But in southern Lebanon, there's, of course, major fighting going on near Majd el-Zaoun. The mayor of Majd el-Zaoun basically said that, and he's like the leading political leader from actually elected. I don't believe he's a member of Hezbollah, or he may not even be a Shia Muslim, but the mayor of Majd el-Zaoun basically just said, look, the Israelis are doing whatever they want around the town. They're pushing their red line forward. So even the local politicians, locally elected, are basically claiming that the Israelis are complete monsters and predators. It's not just simply a Hezbollah talking point. It's like the reality is all the Lebanese south of the Litani River completely can see the reality is that the Israelis are the aggressors in this war. They do not look like they're going to be leaving. And there's, of course, fighting going on in Al-Mansuri and, of course, the town of Bin Jbeil, which is pretty much surrounded by the Israeli forces. Bin Jbeil appears to have some sort of Hezbollah groups within it or in the surrounding foothills, and probably maybe even Hezbollah bunkers or some sort of deep trenches located there. And there seems to be a lot of fighting. So Israeli airstrikes, we have, Merkava tanks operating in the particular vicinity, but there's a huge, of course, fog of war currently ongoing, and no doubt there's obviously many casualties being suffered, probably by both sides, that are being entirely unreported, because the fighting there is currently probably just as hot as what we've seen in Konstantinovka and some of the other really hot zones of the Third World War. So at the moment, southern Lebanon is very much a battle zone that is being pushed forward and aggressed upon, specifically by the Israelis, and we do have Hezbollah on the defensive. Of course, there's always this looming threat of the Syrian, Sunni Muslim, radical Takfiri invasion from the east, but at this point, from what we've heard, there's no necessarily planned incursion ongoing. At least there hasn't been a PR move by Western media sources to say, oh, this is why the forces in Damascus entering into Lebanon is a good thing. As soon as we see headlines like that, Conrad, we can probably conclude that, look, there's going to be some sort of strike within the next week from the Takfiri, former ISIS, Al-Qaeda fighters into Lebanon in order to secure peace and to intervene. But yes, the United Nations has shown itself to be entirely useless in terms of, actually keeping the Israelis at bay and for sort of protecting the local Lebanese civilians. I'm not even saying sort of intervene on the side of Hezbollah, but just to protect the local people. The United Nations have shown the peacekeeping forces, and yeah, these are mostly like Bangladeshis, folks from Kosovo, Italy, etc. So probably not the most, shall we say, military capable countries or communities, but still, the UN forces are just not showing many results, which I think sort of is, we've said the international law has pretty much died, and the international world post-World War II order is breaking down, and this is like one of those breaking points. People are going to look back at the UN experience in Lebanon and say, look, yeah, we're not going to be advocating for this structure to continue its existence. The Blue Helmet existence is, of course, a project which needs to be completely dismantled and changed in some major way. So, unfortunately, the Lebanese people are still suffering at the hands of basically radical Zionist expansion. As you said, the Greater Israel Project is well and truly going forward.
No, undoubtedly. And we talked about the, potential Azerbaijani, Moroccan troops that would enter into Gaza. Of course, Turkey is the country that Israel wanted to not be involved in the Board of Peace, as if, the Board of Peace is really going to be what has the final say in all of this. But again, we're going to talk about Russia and Ukraine and the war on the Black Sea here in a second. But when it comes to the proxies, things are really shaping up. I want to encourage everybody to listen to my appearance on the Jay Burden show. I should have mentioned this at the beginning. Really great interview with Jay Burden, fellow Substacker, very popular interview show there, very based Christian, right-wing, nationalist guy. So be sure to check that out. One of the best interviews I've done in a while. Some of the best interview questions I feel like I've been asked, on the level of, Greg Reese interview, maybe even a little bit better if you're into just the pure geopolitics. Obviously, it's about the prophecies as well, but I really go deep on the geopolitics when it comes to Turkey and how the prophecies interplay with, geopolitical realism and having a honest perspective of what's really going on with an understanding of all the factions involved. So be sure to check that out. But of course, again, we're seeing this reality where it's obvious why Erdogan's fall is so critical to all of this, because he's, forging these allies with the Ummah, like you said, Dmitry. He is making sure his guys involved in Syria. He's, as we discussed with Yaqub Sarraf, former Lebanese defense minister, on our last talk with him, he's seeking to forge connections with Joseph Ayoun and Nawaf Salam in Lebanon. And of course, he has influence over Hamas in Palestine, as now basically everything except the main Politburo of Hamas is hosted in Turkey. Their intelligence, their all sorts of things, they all moved towards Turkey. So not only does that, of course, give them influence in Palestine, but it also opens them up directly to Israeli strikes and Israeli aggression, because Israel struck Qatar, Israel struck Iran directly, bombing their embassy in Syria, and they bombed, killing Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. All of these strikes justified by taking out Hamas leadership. So Turkey has never been more vulnerable to an Israeli strike until that point. Erdogan, of course, is viewed as directly responsible. Him and Hakan Fidan openly meet with Hamas officials regularly. And in the midst of all of this, of course, not only are they forging these defense ties with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and we know that the Israelis are warning against the new Sunni axis. They're already preparing for their new boogeyman and justification for expanding the Greater Israel Project after they wrap things up in Persia. But Erdogan, when he goes, the Kemalists take power, they're not going to be interested in controlling Syria. They want to send all the immigrants back to Syria, which I guess in a way coincides with Erdogan's interests, because a powerful Sunni state is what would ostensibly cause a lot of these refugees who fled during Bashar al-Assad, cause them to return. Many of these people, of course, terrorists, but those are the people that were used to take over these Uzbek, these other radical Wahhabis that the Qataris and the Turks used. So again, they want the return of those people. They will not want to be pursuing a sort of pro-Russia, pro-US, policy. Of course, they won't be able to openly be pro-Israel, because Turkish public opinion would radically turn against it. I mean, look what happened. Turkish people had to be arrested for attacking Azerbaijani state oil facilities and headquarters in Turkey, because they viewed Azerbaijan as an Israeli ally. And to be fair, look at Azerbaijan. There aren't protests in Azerbaijan over their support for Israel, although Azerbaijan has, to my surprise, at a certain level, really stayed out of the Iran war. They've made it very clear that they don't want to be party to the aggression against Iran, which, again, I think they're just scared of Iranian strikes. I mean, if Saudi Arabia can't protect itself against Iranian strikes, what would Azerbaijan be able to do, right? So I think they know what's going on there. But obviously, maybe Turkish public opinion would shift, but on a long enough, I mean, who knows what the Kemalists would do? Would the Kemalists be willing to go so far as to say, like, we need to not be against Israel? Greece is the real problem. I mean, I don't know who would really fall for that, but the reason that there won't necessarily be an issue as far as the prophecies being fulfilled is that Greece and Israel and Cyprus are sort of forming into one defense block already. And when you have, again, think of the possibilities. Erdogan, a lot of reasons to go to Syria, a lot of reasons to go to Libya now that the factions there's been a lot of fighting, there's been a lot of disruption, but Turkey has been working with the United States and other factions there to try to reconcile the Tripoli-based and Benghazi-based groups, the Haftar group versus the Tripoli-based group. What are they? They're like the presidential council, or the whatever the parliament was. That's what they are part of. So trying to reconcile those two parties. And there again are prophecies and predictions that say that on his return flight from one of those places, he'll be shot down. Again, likely by Israel. I would say he'd be shot down, maybe by Israel in Syria, or Israel, directly if he was returning from Syria. Whereas if he was returning from Libya, we talked about it in our previous episode and on other recent discussions, the new Greece, Israel, new kind of Iron Dome deal that they're deploying with these new defense packages on the Aegean Islands and around Turkey, basically to protect Israel from Turkey via Greece and Cyprus. Well, imagine an Israeli air defense battery shoots down Erdogan's plane from Crete. Next thing you know, you have your casus belli for the Turkish invasion of the Greek islands. I explain all of this as well in the interview with Jay Burden, so good reason to check all of that out. But of course, what would come immediately after that? Well, if Turkey's going to get away with invading Greek islands and this new Kemalist government is going to be supported by the United States, well, they're going to have to grease some palms. They're going to have to actually do something, and certainly not going to be allowed to attack Israel. What they need to do is what? Close the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits to the Russians. And of course, that's becoming more and more of a real kind of mechanic and sort of a real lever that the West has against Russia, a form of leverage, because Russia's blockade against Odessa and Nikolaev, their strikes against these ships, both in ports and in the Black Sea, are escalating rapidly. It's over 50+% of Ukraine's grain shipments and exports, I think, have been effectively halted because of this because of this Russian blockade. And again, Ukraine is one of the largest suppliers of grain to the world. We remember all of the hours of, frankly, it was one of the most boring things we ever had to talk about in the history of this show, was the hand-wringing over the grain deal in Turkey between the Russian and the Ukrainians. And I'm frankly glad to see that we're just bombing the grain ships, at least the Russians are. So, of course, the Ukrainians are responding in kind by striking Russian energy. So this is undoubtedly tit for tat. And of course, just in the past few days, massive drone strikes, according to the governor of the Yaroslavl Oblast. The largest ever attack by enemy drones targeted 93 targets in the region. Well, apparently they were intercepted, and then dozens, of course, struck their targets because we have smoke rising from major refinery plants and others in the Yaroslavl region, Oblast, which again is 160 miles northeast of Moscow. So these are major strikes. Of course, in response to the Wildberries strikes that we've discussed recently, Russia responded in kind, and apparently Ukraine has lost more than half of their Kiev region warehouse space in recent Russian strikes. So that's what's going on in Ukraine. Dmitry, I'd love your thoughts both on what's going on the ground, in the air, and on the Black Sea, of course, because the blockade seems to be really the biggest escalation that the media isn't really talking about. It's really only those that are paying attention to this day to day and have this sort of understanding of how important the Black Sea is as a theater that are recognizing this really important strategic shift.
No, certainly. The blockade of the 3 ports located in the Odessa Oblast that are currently ongoing, primarily to, of course, Chernnomorsk, the most southern port of Ukraine, the one the closest to the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Strait, is the main target of the Russians. The Russians are well and truly pushing the accelerator, trying to bring the Kiev regime to some sort of ceasefire, valid ceasefire discussions, trying to basically force Zelensky to come to the negotiating table. I genuinely think that's probably the main goal. And because if a ceasefire could be established on Russia's terms in favor of the Russians, perhaps the Ukraine even temporarily seceding territories and those remaining 10, 11% that they hold in the Donetsk People's Republic. And then, of course, the Russians could maybe leave Kharkivshina, Sumshina, and those particular locales, then the Russians could then maybe turn their eyes to other geopolitical strategic interests, potentially even allying and assisting more of the Iranians in the south, and potentially even try to rebuild their surface-to-air missile radar systems, maybe secure their Black Sea Navy. So the Russians, in a way, and I've heard analysts within Russia say this quite often, that the minimal claims of Vladimir Putin at the moment is just to take back the Donbass, the 2 Donbass republics. It's not necessarily even to claim the constitutional cities of Zaporozhye or Kherson, although most of us would agree that Russia needs to go a lot further than this in order to secure bloodless future, because even a multi-year ceasefire agreement, even a standstill for a half a decade, will not necessarily stop a future incursion and a future radicalization, and definitely a genocide within Ukraine, and probably even church persecution will continue if the Russians simply say that sort of piecemeal neutral ceasefire agreement will be all that they will be seeking. So, but at this point, the Russians are under immense pressure. Obviously, economically speaking, you can see this because there's been a recent development. The Russian treasury has begun to sell uncut diamonds in large quantities. We're talking about tons of natural resources, which again are being sold probably, and look, I say this speculatively, but it appears to be that the Russians have begun to sell uncut diamonds at a greatly discounted price. So in Russian, of course, they're called almazy, and cut diamonds are called brilliante, but almaz sales have gone through the roof. The Russians have actually put up, they're saying, look, we have tons of uncut diamonds we're going to be selling. So the Russians are starting to say, almost point to the fact that, look, we are actually economically suffering. This hasn't been necessarily an advantageous economic boost position. And of course, there are also calls from within Russia, from people like Dmitry Medvedev and the mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, who have said basically that there are no plans for mobilization. Now, the positions are somewhat different. So Dmitry Medvedev, he's openly said that anyone who claims that the Russians need to mobilize is a foreign agent and a traitor to the fatherland, which is insane. Again, Medvedev's sort of drunken rants are getting a little bit out of hand. He's basically saying military analysts who call for Russia to mobilize and to arm more troops in order to achieve their ends in the special military operation, they are traitors. We don't need to mobilize. Dmitry Medvedev also gave us some statistics. He said in the first period of in the first 6-month period of 2026, the Russians have recruited and conscripted contractually speaking, another 250,000 soldiers. So he says that there's a current inflow of armed infantrymen, Marines, etc., that the Russians are taking on board. So he's saying there's no shortage of troops on the front lines. A mobilization is unnecessary, but also a mobilization would take specific people from the Russian community, various citizens who fill in other economic roles and service roles and roles within the Russian various industries away from where they work in the civilian sense, and be forced to, again, potentially definitely earn more money on the front lines, but the greater Russian economy will suffer. And I think that's exactly what Sergei Sobyanin said to the main director, Kondratsev, on TASS in a recent interview. So Sobyanin, but we knew that Sobyanin was always a dove in terms of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. He's primarily representing not just Moscow, but also he's, I think, the head of the Council of Regions. So he has a very sort of pro, shall we say, capitalistic perspective on the entire thing. He just wants business to continue as per usual, which includes, of course, the cultural replacement and the mass migration, which Sobyanin was always in favor of, and the fact that you go to Moscow and you see like a huge proportion of the population being migrants. That's part of like the fruits of Sobyanin's local Moscow policy. So he's a very curious character, definitely a member of United Russia Party. But you're right, Conrad, the Ukrainians have commenced again more terrorist strikes against various oil refineries. In fact, 2 oil refineries struck this week, as you said, in Yaroslavl, which is so far away from Ukraine, 435 miles from the border, and just so far northeast of Moscow. You almost wondering, how are these drones basically getting through these gaps in SAM and the radar systems of the Russians and reaching these targets and so far north? I mean, these are territories which I don't even think the Mongol horde reached during their incursion in the mid-1200s in the 13th century. And of course, the most striking impacts of the Ukrainian drones were in the Republic of Bashkortostan. And Bashkortostan, the Bashkiria, is located east of Tatarstan. So we're talking about east of the Volga. These are places which even the Germans didn't reach during the Second World War. I don't even think even any German planes flew that far east. This is like on the south of the Ural Mountains, just west of Yekaterinburg. So far away, 808 miles from the Ukrainian border. So we have basically the Ukrainian drones flying as far as you have, I mean, even further than the Iranian drones that were flying to Israel during the 12-day war in 2025, or even during the Purim war in 2026. Very, very long range, and they're somehow bypassing and striking at Russia's, so to speak, soft underbelly. And if you draw maybe as the crow flies as straight lines from Ukraine all the way into the southern territories of Russia that are being struck constantly, the ones that border with Kazakhstan, you can almost maybe even somewhat throw up some question marks as to, is Kazakhstan actually noticing these drones flying right next to their borders? Does Kazakhstan have any radar systems, surface-to-air missiles on its own territories? Potentially these Ukrainian drones, and I'm saying this hypothetically, allegedly could be flying through Kazakhstan territory. And of course, Kazakhstan is a member of the Abraham Accords, etc. There's some interesting collaborations going on with the British military as well. Militarily speaking, like Kazakhstan has really taken this neutral fence-sitting position among all the great powers, China, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the US. So it's some very big concerns on the southern underbelly of the Russian Federation, which we've said for a while. Even Solzhenitsyn's pointed this out in the late 1970s. This is going to be a major problem. Like, what's happening in south of Russia, it's not just the heroin, the drug trade, the human smuggling, all these other things that are taking place there. It is the Mexico question of the Russian Federation that hasn't been addressed yet. So in the future, maybe we'll see some major implications on that end. But of course, there's been major warehouses struck. Some people are throwing out these massive numbers, Conrad, like 20% of the wild berries warehouses have now been taken offline within the Russian Federation. But I'm not sure if we can actually take those major percentages as evidence. But this week, there's been a Tverskaya Oblast warehouse struck, Yekaterinburg, which is again south of the Ural Mountains, so far away from the front lines, Krasny Bor in the Leningradskaya Oblast, that's outside of St. Petersburg, Chekhovskaya in the town of Chekhov, which is Moskovskaya Oblast, Vladimirskaya Oblast, which is again east of Moscow. You had Samarskaya Oblast, which is very, very, very far away. Again, it's almost at the footsteps of Siberia being struck by these Ukrainian drones. So the Ukrainians, again, are hitting the Russian consumers. They're hitting the regular goyim. I want to keep in mind the strikes against wild berry warehouses, and if we see the Ukrainians expand to the Azon warehouses as well, these are strikes against basically regular Russian consumers. They want the Russian the Russian electorate to come out onto the street and protest against the Putin regime. But we know from precedent that simply doesn't happen. When the regular people are negatively impacted, they don't necessarily revolt against the regime in power. They mostly get agitated and they get triggered and they say, look, Putin needs to nuke Kiev and say other absurd, hawkish things. So It's the regular Russian citizens which are suffering. But at the same time, the Russian tit-for-tat responses, I'm not sure if it's exactly adequate. The Russians are striking at Rosetka warehouses and other major, basically Amazon-like warehouses across Ukraine, in Kiev, etc. And it's like, but that's just hurting regular Ukrainian consumers, the Ukrainian people who are just ordering furniture, ordering utensils, anything for their homes, food. It's like not really, clothing, like it's not necessarily even striking at any sort of, shall we say, decision-making centers. This is a bit of a soft response. So perhaps leaders within the Russian Federation should really put their mind towards, okay, how do we stop this hyper-aggression, these terrorist strikes? And clearly, speaking of terrorism, there was a Russian general whose wedding, his daughter's wedding, was in fact attacked within Moscow, I believe, where his daughter was left with severe brain damage. It's another sort of case of Vladlen Tatarsky style terrorism, like the strike that killed him in the St. Petersburg cafe, where the Ukrainians gave him a little, I think it was like a toy miniature statue gift. There was a bomb hidden inside of it. It blew up, killing multiple people. It's the same sort of situation. There was like a gift with a bomb inside. And this is like ISIS-level terrorism that the Ukrainians are carrying out. And yes, they are aiming for basically Russian generals, Russian key military figures within the Russian Federation themselves. And people are saying, oh, this is where the red line has been crossed, and maybe this is where Zelensky will die. It's like, well, I don't know. It's been 4 years of these sort of terroristic strikes against key decision makers and figures within the Russian Federation. Russia has hundreds of generals, even if the general himself actually survived the bombing. But again, we are sort of waiting for a proper, prominent response by the leaders within the Kremlin, something that is somewhat weightier than what we've seen in terms of actually blockading Odessa, or even potentially, striking at these various economic warehouses. And now that I think the Ukraine has again begun targeting these oil refineries, this is a new point of escalation for them. And potentially speaking, we will see Vladimir Putin somewhat escalate the situation. Now, the argument against this, I just need to point this out, is the fact that there was recently a huge reshuffle in some of the command posts around the Ministry of Defense. But keep in mind, this is not Putin unilaterally making these decisions. Now, this new sort of appointment of generals and servicemen to the various command centers around the Russian Federation and the Special Military Operations Zone, all of these 4 or 5 appointments are all, of course, given to Putin in briefs. Like, Putin himself doesn't probably know these people personally. These are, of course, given to him by General Gerasimov, who's the head of the Russian Armed Forces, and by Andrei Belousov. Clearly these are all filtered through those two figures. And so this is not necessarily, this is maybe more or less some of Shoigu's old folks basically being retired or moved to separate positions, and Belousov and Gerasimov are putting in some of their people in positions of decision-making within the Special Military Operations Zone. The implications of that are, of course, that Russia is going to slow down its offensive rather than increase it with haste, because these new figures, once they need to become acquainted with their new positions of administration and management within, of course, the Special Military Operations Zone, they need to actually have this, I suppose, new sort of introduction. There needs to be a proper handover of command, etc. So maybe this is some sort of preparation for the winter period of 2026 later in the year, which is very unfortunate. But it does show that the Russians are not against necessarily militarily reshuffling, just as we see that happening in Ukraine, so in Russia as well. So there's clearly some major moves happening here and there, but we are almost, in a way, just as we await for President Donald J. Trump to make a final decision on Iran, we're also waiting for Vladimir Putin perhaps to at least present some sort of consolidated vision of how a righteous retaliation against the Zelensky terrorist regime can be carried out, because at this point it is very strongly demoralizing. And I think the morale, not just of the troops on the front lines, but also those in the rear, civilian workers, those who are ultimately contributing to the military operation by just paying their taxes, the various Russian citizens are somewhat scratching their heads, because at this point the war's been going on for very, very long, and the impact on them is increasing almost with every single month as the Ukrainians are arrogantly crossing red lines day by day. So very concerning news from the Eastern European front.
No, it is just the slow, sure escalation. And again, Kiev specifically continues to get more and more destroyed. Again, I believe that the escalation is necessary and good strategy, but beautiful European city, being constantly bombarded by missiles, you do hate to see it. And of course, it was also this week that military advisor to Iran's supreme leader, Major General Mohsen Rezaian of the IRGC, He openly said we had prepared to strike 3 different locations in Ukraine, but after they publicly apologized for striking our vessel, we decided not to escalate. I wonder if those strikes would have been more effective than the Russian strikes. I wonder if on their first entry into the European conflict, the Iranians would have just been like, boom, take out a Ukrainian general, boom, take out, the Ukrainian intelligence center, something like that. Who knows what they would have struck, or if they would have just been symbolic strikes. We won't know until the Ukrainians potentially re-enter the conflict, but it seems that they are not interested in doing that anymore, and that the Caspian Sea will likely, only Russian targets, I guess, will be struck in the Caspian Sea, but it's clear that the Iranians are also watching Caspian Sea and other, places around the world where their ships are to make sure that they're not going to get struck. But again, we talked about the closure of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits to the Russians by the Turks under many different future circumstances, and a big escalation in that regard. This is from an energy source. It says, European buyers are demanding that Turkey provide documentation proving natural gas transported through Turkish territory is not of Russian origin. Turkish Energy Minister Alparslan Bayraktar said in an interview with A Haber TV on August 6th. Notice, Bayraktar, the Turkish drone company. He's also the Turkish Energy Minister. Bayraktar said Turkey is legally obliged to process the supplies and provided EU buyers with certificates of origin, but that gas entering the Turkish system from different sources is mixed together in pipelines before it reaches Europe, making its nationality impossible to establish in practice, even though around 40% of Turkey's own gas supply still comes from Russia, and Ankara has no plans to give those imports up. Turkey has capacity to export 70 to 80 billion cubic meters of gas a year via multiple routes, Bayraktar said, and pointed to the Turk Stream pipeline's importance for Turkey's own domestic energy security. The pipeline is also the route by which several EU holdouts, including Hungary and Slovakia, still receive Russian gas despite the bloc's efforts to end Russian energy purchases. The dispute lands as the EU presses ahead with sanctions regardless of the cost to its own supply. European Commission spokesperson Anna Kaisia Itkonen said at a Brussels briefing on August 4th that the EU intends to ban all Russian energy from European markets and remains well on the way to making this strategy come to a successful conclusion, adding that a complete permanent ban on Russian oil is also being pursued, notwithstanding continuing electricity and gas shortages inside the bloc. Bayraktar said the EU's refusal to accept Russian gas had itself worsened Europeans' energy situation. His comments came as EU storage sits at a record low for early August, and as gas operators warned in late July that the bloc will not accumulate the volume it needs for winter, given intensified competition for LNG cargoes from Asia and an unusually hot European summer. And of course, Turkey, obviously, they need those Russian oil imports. The other big news that happened, I probably should have maybe mentioned it earlier, but Turkey and Iraq signed a big deal to putting the goal to be 750,000 barrels shipped per day through the Iraq-Turkey pipeline, the only major Iraqi pipeline still being operated. And if you look at it on a map, of course, it starts in, sort of central northern Iraq, travels up north quickly, and then runs along entirely the Turkish-Syrian border all the way to the port city of Ceyhan in Turkey, right there just north of Syria, right near Cyprus, where it would then be exported elsewhere or, potentially connected to other pipelines within Turkey. So Turkey is, becoming this major energy hub. We've heard about the gas hub with Russia alliance, but it's clear that, the EU and other countries are pressuring Turkey to cut off Russia as their natural gas supplier. And you can see how cutting off Russia from the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits is not that big of an escalation for this. And of course, the Turkey-Iraq pipeline, which again, shipping 750,000 barrels of oil a day, that's a big resource. That's a big boon to the global oil economy to get oil out of the region amidst this war with Iran. Well, that pipeline could be completely destroyed by the Iranians, and they only have to strike within Iraq. They wouldn't even have to strike Turkey and bring them into the conflict. Maybe Turkey would have a problem with that, but that's something that the Iranians could take out in 10 minutes with a few precision-guided missiles. So again, same thing with the Saudi pipeline that is now transporting oil from the Persian Gulf back over to the Red Sea. These things are all very, very fragile. And again, with the Turkish-Russia connection, again, Erdogan and Bayraktar and these people, again, they were willing to sell Bayraktar drones to the Ukrainians, but they, of course, also want to take in Russian gas. And eventually, that playing both sides that the Erdogan regime has been able to do for the past several decades, that eventually is going to come to an end, and they will be forced, I think, through the assassination of their leader, as well as, again, pressure from the blocs in which they are a part of, specifically NATO. They will be pressured to ultimately not threaten Israel as much as they could. They'll be allowed to move against Greece, and they will, of course, close the straits to the Russians. But again, this could be preceded by more movements into Syria, into Iraq, and to the point where they really are threatening Israel, in Erdogan's later waning years.
No, certainly. And we have heard, of course, for one of the chief Israeli generals actually mentioning very expressly that, they will be forming a sort of coalitionary front, but not just between Israel and, say, Greece and Cyprus, but also there's a greater security framework being developed. And this is, of course, these reports are coming from Major General Amir Baram. And you can actually see Amir Baram, he has his red Israeli beret sort of hidden under one of his shoulder pads, which sort of signifies he is, of course, from the Tzanhanim, the sort of serpentine airborne Israeli commando squad, the sort of the most powerful infantrymen commandos of the Israeli IDF army. So this is a man, obviously, with some extreme experience, and he looks like a very intense IDF general, but he expressly said basically that he's had meetings in New Delhi in June of 2026. It appears that there will be this restructuring of the Israelis' future defense considerations to include not just Greece, Cyprus, but also the United Arab Emirates and India. So there's going to be this almost, shall we say, bifurcated, just as the Sunni Muslim countries are getting together and trying to reconstruct some sort of defense agreements. There's also this Zionist project being created in the background. And he, of course, said that the Eastern Mediterranean needs to become the safe zone for the Israelis, and the Cypriots and the Greeks and of course the Greek Cypriots, firstly, he's mentioning, are, of course, some of the key actors that are going to contribute to all of this. So the Israelis are preparing for this new reality of maybe even a post-Iranian conflict Middle East that will, of course, heavily hyperfixate on them and what has happened previously during the Syrian war, the reshuffling, and again, the Turkish influence, of course, on Lebanon, on some of these Eastern Mediterranean zones. And it's incredibly concerning that, again, the Israelis are already taking an aggressive, hawkish position. Very, very sad, Conrad, that, of course, the Greeks are in their sort of delusions and in my view, are taking probably the wrong position here. Instead of remaining somewhat neutral and distancing themselves from the genocide taking place in Palestine and Gaza, they're almost taking a very anti-Islamist position, and that's the perspective they're coming from. It's almost like the opposite of Spain in a way. Greece is really taking the pro-Israeli road, and not just the Greek people. I think that primarily it's the Greek prime ministerial presidential administration that is, of course, pushing this entire agenda. Maybe even the Greek military is led by people who, again, are trying to take a very anti-Turkish stance. And if that means allying with Israel, if that means allying with the Indians, right, or the Emiratis, for that matter, that's something that they're willing to, again, come to the table for, because they understand the U.S., especially after this Trump visit in July to Ankara of this year, the U.S. maybe is an unreliable ally for the Greeks. The Greeks were very critical of the F-35 and the other Air Force technology being, of course, provided to the Turks, or at least offered to the Turkish regime. And they, of course, see the U.S. maybe as a somewhat of unreliable ally, whereas Israel is somewhat on parity with Greece. They both have a powerful air force. They're both not the largest countries in the region, and they do have a future potential common enemy. But if anything, I think, Conrad, sadly, this would only put Greece more in the crosshairs of Turkey, just the closer it allies itself with Israel. So very bad, I think, long-term implications here. And Major General Amir Baram, this Israeli hawk, is, of course, sort of eyeing the opportunity to, use, I think, Orthodox Christian Greeks as basically a battering ram against their northern enemies. I think that's probably what's happening. And he's happy to use the Indian Goyim and the Emiratis as well in support of, again, perpetrating and pushing Israeli interests. There's no doubt about that. The Israelis love to use their allies as their human shields, and in multiple conflicts they've done this over and over again.
No, it's true, and we all just wonder, how will St. Paisios and St. Porphyrios's words, really come to pass, right? When will the Russians descend down when the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits is closed? When will the Russians reach the Mount Tabor and the gates of Jerusalem in their battle against the Turks and against other actors, potentially, as the prophecies say? That's what we are, of course, looking out for. But as we finish things up in Russia, Ukraine, of course, earlier today, that's of course August 7th, the U.S. Senate passed Senate Bill 5025, also known as the Lindsey O. Graham Sanctioning Russia Act of 2026. They passed by a margin of 86-11, so the bill's now getting sent to the House, and the key provisions in this include an up to 500% tariff on goods imported directly from Russia, up to 100% tariffs on imported goods from the largest purchasers of Russian crude oil and natural gas, as well as countries determined to be facilitating Russian sanctions evasion, expanded sanctions targeting Russian government officials, banks, energy companies, vessels involved in sanctions evasion, and entities supporting Russia's defense industrial base, new restrictions on investment in Russia, Russian energy exports, uranium imports, sovereign debt purchases, and access to international financing messaging systems. if enacted, the legislation would represent one of the most comprehensive U.S. sanction packages against Russia since the start of the war in Ukraine, while also increasing economic pressure on third countries that continue purchasing Russian energy. So Lindsey Graham continues to fight back from the grave. And since the Iran war had already gotten started, I guess it manifested itself in the form of anti-Russian sanctions. So thank you, but man, I'm sure you're not in a great place. So I guess that's that. But of course, that is the latest. You mentioned Mitsotakis in Greece, Dmitry. This week, Mitsotakis is calling on the European Union to adopt new rules to counter the deliberate use of migration as a geopolitical tool of pressure. The proposal includes the activation of an emergency mechanism that would allow member states to temporarily suspend asylum applications and accelerate returns in the event of orchestrated mass influxes. Mitsotakis argues that current mechanisms are insufficient to deal with hybrid crises, but insists that any exceptional measure must respect the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the principle of non-refoulement and be strictly limited in time and proportionate to the threat. So he obviously cuckolds out at the very end, but it's good. I mean, Greece has always been one of the better countries at handling immigrant boats and these things. They are willing to sink the boats. They're willing to send them back. They're willing to arrest everyone and deport them. So much better than Spain, much better than other countries. But unfortunately, and this makes sense, and there are even prophecies about this. I mean, Metropolitan Neophytos talks about it. St. Paisios talked about it. Elder Joseph Vatopedi talked about it, how Turkey will basically activate a lot of immigrants that they send into the Balkans and Greece and Europe to fight for them in the side of Turkey. So again, Turkey has undoubtedly probably done this. They have a extreme glut of Islamic immigrants from the Middle East that they could undoubtedly deploy to the islands against Greece. And some Greek islands have experienced major Islamic invasion. They've cracked down more. I mean, I remember a few years ago, it was really crazy in Greece, but obviously this is in response to the migrant crisis in Spain. And so Greece, despite still being run by one of the most cuckolded governments in Greek history, they're still, from the EU, one of the main countries pushing for border security. And they're the main country right now that's holding back and vetoing the current EU sanctions package against Russia. So before we move on, Dmitry, there also is actually an agreement was signed yesterday with Mitsotakis for the entry of the French investment group Meridiam as a majority shareholder in the Great Sea Interconnector Company established for the electrical interconnection between Greece and Cyprus. This is a positive development, significantly increases the French interest associated with the successful completion of the project. Meridiam joins Nexans, which supplies the cable. It should be noted that regardless of the specific positive development, the core of the strategic problem regarding GSI remains the handling of Turkish reactions on the ground, about which we have previously written that Greece cannot depend on allies. From this perspective, it's interesting that blah, blah, blah. Either way, clear that they claim the Turks will interfere with this interconnecting cable between Greece and Cyprus. This is another bringing French investment into the region. France is sort of Erdogan and Turkey's main opposition when it comes to European politics. But again, France is also against Israel. So interesting developments, to say the least. But of course, that's what's going on with Greece and the EU. Dmitry, what are your thoughts on this? And of course, that sanctions package that the U.S. Senate just voted on that I don't know if it'll pass the House, but I think it'll be close at the very least.
No, certainly that's extremely concerning. I think mostly because it, again, agitates the Turkish issue. It, again, forces a lot of Turkish hawks to stand up, make their proclamations in preparation for the fall of Erdogan, for the changing of the guard within Turkey itself. And this is going to be one of those, maybe not the greatest escalation point, but it's going to be one of those consolidating issues that together in a compendium of sorts will be the pretext which the Turks will require in order to enact their aggression against the Greeks. And whether or not that will bring in Israel on the side of Greece in the sort of defensive pact alliance that they are constructing and building and bring into the future, we'll see that. But I think as soon as the Turks do engage with the Greeks, we'll see a lot of these prophecies begin to, again, turn into motion. And sadly, this will be a great event it's not necessarily a triumph for the Greeks because we know how it will end positively, hopefully, if the majority of the Greeks do repent, but it's a time of local, temporal, worldly judgment for the Greek people first and foremost, and for the Turks who engage in any sort of violence against their Orthodox Christian neighbors. So it very much is a time of a huge repentance and contemplation, I think, for everyone in the Eastern Mediterranean, and this is just one of those major, dominoes that is currently falling when we're watching it in real time.
No, it really is. And again, we're going to be monitoring the situation closely. Of course, again, the possibility of whether there's some kind of resolution in favor of Iran or not, it's clear that when that reaches its either zenith and expands to other fronts or is resolved, we will then be fully focused in on the Turkey front. So this whole time, we've really just been giving you a sneak peek, a direct, I think, line into what's really going to be next in the Third World War, which, what else would we be doing as World War now, right? So thank you all for tuning in here to the end of the show. Of course, we got to talk about church news here at the end. And of course, the situation in Ukraine, the persecution continues, but the solidarity among other Orthodox churches also continues. This is from Ortho Christian. A hierarch of the Serbian Orthodox Church traveled to the Sumy Diocese of the UOC this week to voice support for Ukrainian metropolitan facing an ongoing legal case, in a visit that underscored fraternal ties between the two Orthodox churches. His Eminence Metropolitan Grigory of Dusseldorf and all Germany of the Serbian Church visited His Eminence Metropolitan Evgensi in the Sumy Diocese on August 4th and 5th. During their meeting, Metropolitan Grigory offered his prayerful support to Metropolitan Evlogi after the legal proceedings and conveyed words of encouragement to the clergy and faithful of the diocese who continue to face hardship amid an ongoing war. Ukrainian authorities began investigating Metropolitan Evlogi in February 2024 for publicly talking about how most local Orthodox churches support the UOC rather than the schismatic OCU. Metropolitan Grigory also visited the Transfiguration Cathedral and Trinity Cathedral in Sumy, praying at both sites and learning more about the life of the diocese. So again, good to see Serbian canonical Ukrainian solidarity. And that's not just a Serbian bishop, that's, a EU Serbian bishop from Germany. So he could actually, face retaliation for this. So that is good to see. Of course, the director of the Kiev-Pечersk Lavra National Reserve, so sort of the Zog government overseer of the Kiev-Pечersk Lavra under the, Zelensky government, he said that the Kiev-Pечersk Lavra should eventually become a Ukrainian Vatican and whatnot. So that is the vision, I guess, an ecumenist, more lenient on LGBT. They want to really be more like a museum. They claim that the presence of the monks, disrupts its activities as a museum. So very unfortunate developments. But what did the prophecy of Elder Zosima of Donbass say? He said all the grace of the Kiev-Pечersk Lavra would leave and move to Optina. So it seems that, that is what many Ukrainians want. They want that prophecy to be fulfilled, at least in Ukraine, so it seems. But what are your thoughts on these, as well as other stories you might have from the Ukraine, Dmitry, the center of Christian persecution in our day?
Certainly, I think, that prophecy of Elder Zosima, I think, is entirely accurate. It is possible for the Lord's grace, the Holy Spirit, the grace of God to leave a certain location. The best example we have, I think, from church history, where it was visibly the grace was leaving a particular location, was during the siege of Constantinople in 1453, when obviously the ecumenist Uniate service was taking place within the Hagia Sophia. Suddenly, amidst the eclipse, the sort of darkening, there was a great mist over the city. This is like a day before it fell, and the people could see within the Constantinople itself a huge pillar of light ascending from the top dome of the Hagia Sophia into the sky, and almost, this very sort of end times like sign. And once the pillar ascended, it's almost as if the grace has left the once New Rome holy city of Constantinople because of the betrayal of orthodoxy and other things. So it's just this really powerful sort of symbolism there. And maybe one day with Gregory His, we will have sort of an in-depth discussion of those very tumultuous events, that sort of one of the greatest cataclysms of the Orthodox world, the 1453 siege and fall of Constantinople. That would be an upcoming episode. So definitely subscribe on Substack and support us for us to sort of look into that major event. We've been contemplating that for quite a while. Definitely a great discussion to have. But just in relation to that Kiev-Pечersk Lavra event, Conrad, it's not surprising because the other Lavra in Ukraine, Western Ukraine, the Pachayev Lavra, fortunately, the events surrounding the great Orthodox Christian procession near the city of Lvov towards Pachayev Lavra, with thousands of Orthodox Christians proceeded to the Ukrainian Orthodox Christian monastery to celebrate the icon of the Pachayev Theotokos on the 4th and the 5th of August. It came with no surprises, no interruptions at all. So the Ukrainians didn't try to break this Orthodox Christian procession up, and glory to God for that. But of course, the local the local leader of that particular Pachayev Lavra, I guess he's a member of the Ukrainian cultural ministry of culture. Again, this is the same ministry which is constantly contributing to the persecution of Orthodox Christians. He basically claimed that he wants to pressure he said that this procession of Orthodox Christians greatly disrupted the cultural life of the Orthodox community. And I mean, he didn't even reference the Orthodox community. He just said the Ukrainians, this was really disruptive. The fact that Orthodox Christians are walking along the side of a road for multiple days and praying to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, this is actually a bad thing. I'm sorry, it's the most based thing ever, but no, this is actually bad. So these Ukrainian ministers are explaining this to us, and we're just cringing. And he also said that the Pachayev Lavra, should probably move outside, not just leave the Moscow Patriarchate, related Russian Orthodox Church and the UOC, but it should leave the Kievan Metropolitanate altogether. It should become a sort of independent monastery, unrelated to any church. It should be its own functional unit. I mean, just completely insane take so far away from orthodoxy that, I mean, again, these Ukrainian ministers have no idea what they're talking about, and even their local representatives. These people are completely insane. Then this is why, again, we call for Russian success in the special military operation, because these people really need to be outed from any positions of administration or authority. This is, again, God's punishment, I think, for everyone involved, because these people are completely nuts, insane to a core. I did want to mention the meeting between that Serbian hierarch and Metropolitan Yevlogius of Suma. This is, of course, mostly a fortunate good meeting, but we do need to keep in mind, of all the Serbian metropolitans and hierarchs, Metropolitan Gregory Duric is probably the most left-wing ecumenist one. At least the Serbian, from what I've heard among Serbian conservatives, Metropolitan Gregory of Dusseldorf and all of Germany is probably the most, shall we say, I mean, you can kind of tell by his beard, it's a bit too trimmed, if it's a little bit too, if there's a fade going on, it's almost a sign. There's a physiognomy analysis, but we don't want to be too judgmental. So generally speaking, Metropolitan Gregory going there and supporting Metropolitan Yevlogius, who is facing inevitable persecution, is ultimately a good thing, even though he is perhaps more in the left wing of the Serbian church spectrum. The benefit of that is because Sumska Oblast is currently experiencing, Russian incremental advancement, and the city of Suma the Russians are very close to it. Metropolitan Yevlogius is pressured more by, I guess, just the Ukrainian government to move further away from the Moscow Patriarchate and that church. Just keep in mind, Metropolitan Yevlogius of Suma was one of the first Ukrainian hierarchs of the canonical church to stop commemorating Patriarch Kirill at the beginning of the SMO. So he used to have somewhat of a neutral position before the SMO happened towards Ukrainian closeness of the Russians, but he quickly took this very, I want to say in his favor, very maybe pastoral position that he needs to protect his own diocese first and foremost from maybe repressions from the Ukrainian terroristic government. And so he took a very pro-autonomy, pro-autocephaly position, as opposed to maybe a Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye or Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy, these sort of long-standing conservative, very based hierarchs who, are very much, I would say, confessors of the faith. So Metropolitan Yevlogius, yeah, that's just something we need to keep in mind about him. And he has never hid his positions before. And today he says he supports the Ukrainian armed forces on the front lines as best he can, and he prays for them. So that's just the difference of opinions in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. As they're suffering persecution, you do see people take different positions on what exactly is happening to their local homeland, and that's very concerning. And there's been obviously more reports about several Orthodox Christian priests being kidnapped. There's been almost, when an Orthodox Christian priest in Ukraine is being taken by the Ukrainian armed forces, most of the time there is a 1 to 2 week delay in terms of they actually lose complete contact with him. It's almost like they're held in some sort of temporary detention. Maybe they are abused, who knows exactly, but even the bishops of the local Ukrainian diocese, out of which their own priests are being kidnapped and taken, and deacons as well for that matter, it seems like they lose complete touch. There's no, for example, number you can call within the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and say, can we speak to, our detained priest, please, who's now currently being trained to be sent to the trenches. There is no hotline. And Ukrainian law enforcement is entirely on the side of the militarized regime. So things are getting quite bad. The last sort of story, it's a little bit comical again, but I do need to mention it because there are these claims, well, Ukraine is still a Christian country, etc., even though Zelensky is a member of the Talmudic tribe, and openly he has actually his own seat at the chief synagogue inside of Kiev. His name is on the actual seat in the front row as shown by the chief rabbi of Kiev. The chief rabbi of all of Ukraine, Rabbi Azman, met up with the militia leader of the Ukrainian Christian resistance. So Ukraine has been building up over the last few years this sort of weird, they LARP as some of the, I guess, volunteer movements within Russia, like the Sergei Radonezhsky Battalion and all these other groups, the Russian Imperial Legion. They LARP as their own Ukrainian version of the Crusaders. They claim to be Orthodox Christians. They belong, of course, to the Church of Epiphany Dumenko. They have a red labarum, red shiro symbol. They actually occupy, they use one of the occupied churches and halls within the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra as their home base. They constantly have these presentations. And these Ukrainians, they have Orthodox Christian crosses on them, and they pretend serving the regime of Zelensky is somehow like contributing to Ukrainian Orthodoxy, which is insane. Well, the leader of this Ukrainian Orthodox Legion, as he calls it, Dmitry Korchinsky, has recently met with Rabbi Osman, and he said, look, we're actually not anti-Semites at all. And like Rabbi Osman said, I think he was sending a signal to the Israelis. It was actually like a video address where Rabbi Osman is standing next to the Dmitry Korchinsky, and they're basically claiming, look, we're actually not anti-Semites. We're all, us and the Talmudic Jews, we actually stand together in support of Zelensky and defending the homeland of the Ukrainians. So it just sort of shows you pure Shabbos goyness across all fronts. There is actually not a single valid defense movement within Ukraine. We can say maybe unfortunately so, that actually stands up for actual pure Orthodox Christian tradition and maybe has somewhat of a valid claim to actually defending their respective fatherland, which is, the 30-year-old Ukrainian state. Everything is heavily Talmudized. Everything is deeply anti-Orthodox at its core, even those pretending to be Christians, and all of them are somewhat involved in local persecutions, be it in the Kiev-Pечерsk Lavra or other churches and monasteries around the country. So very despicable. Dmitry Korchinsky is somebody who needs to face trial after all of this is done and his crimes. He's like the anti-Igor Strelkov of the movement. Is a very negative figure. He does have his own Wikipedia page worth reading about this antagonist of Orthodox Christian history. He's the new Mazeppa, a very, very evil man, I would say.
I would very much agree with that. And here at the end of the show, we just passed the 2-hour mark as we're recording this final story. This is from Spokane, Washington, still relevant to church news, though. Of course, people saw Spokane, Washington affected by major wildfires that went into the city, destroyed entire neighborhoods. It says here, this is also from Ortho Christian. Emergency evacuations swept through northern Spokane, Washington on Saturday, August 1st, after the Old Trails fire jumped the Spokane River amid winds exceeding 40 miles per hour, high temperatures, and dry conditions. The evacuations affected one of the most populous parts of Spokane County, including parishioners of Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church. Among those evacuated were Father Stephen and Presbytera Irene Supika, who served the parish for 32 years before his retirement in 2020, reports the Greek Orthodox metropolis of San Francisco. Despite the disruption, the parish held great vespers and paraclesis on Saturday evening and continued with divine liturgy on Sunday morning, offering prayers for those affected by the fires in the broader Spokane community. Metropolitan Gerasimos of San Francisco said prayers continue for the faithful of Holy Trinity, their neighbors, and all who have suffered loss, as well as for firefighters and emergency personnel working to protect lives and property. As of Sunday, August 2nd, all parishioners have been accounted for. No deaths have been reported. Father Daniel Triant, parish priest at Holy Trinity, said that while there has been widespread loss of homes and structures in the region, none of the parish's members are known to have lost their homes. He noted that the community members have offered their own homes and resources to those displaced, that he's received numerous messages of support. The fires mark one of the worst wildfire seasons the region has experienced, with nearly 8,000 acres burned and more than 600 structures destroyed as of the latest reports. The situation remains ongoing, with the parish stating it will continue to assess conditions in the coming days. So keep the people in Spokane in your prayers. Of course, I used to live just an hour and a half south of Spokane in Idaho, so I'm somewhat familiar with the region, and it's fire season up there. It's what happens, but it's terrible to see. I mean, the whole world is being gripped by a lot of fires. America, Spokane, California, Washington, Oregon. France had some of their worst fires in a long time, and Greece is being gripped by fires. I mean, earlier this week or last week, 32 people or something had to run into the sea from Crete. They were chased into the ocean by the fire. That's how fast it was spreading. So I think this is just another example of the natural disasters I think we're facing as the prophecies are fulfilled. And apparently we're getting the worst El Nino in 500 to 1,000 years that's about to come and cause crazy natural disasters all over the world. So brace for all of that. But that is all the news we have this week for you on World War Now. Thank you all so much for making it here to the very end. Dmitry, do you have any final thoughts and words for the good people here?
Thank you to all of the patriots, the supporters, even the free listeners. If you're listening on Substack, YouTube, X, thank you for helping out. The least you can do is like, retweet, repost the episode. Thank you for listening until the end. Stay tuned because there's a lot of news most likely coming up on the next episode as we discuss these major geopolitical, diplomatic, and religious developments around the world from the Third World War currently ongoing, as we can all see very evidently before ourselves. And definitely we wish you all the best in this period of moving into the middle of August in 2026. Thank you all for listening.
Well, I hope everyone, this is being recorded on the feast, at least on the new calendar, I believe, of St. Fyodor Ushakov. So pray for us, Holy Admiral Ushakov, amazing saint. Of course, I hope everyone on the new calendar is also participating and staying strong in the Dormition fast. Be sure to keep Dmitry and I in your prayers. And like you said, it is World War III, and I believe that come this fall, it's really when not necessarily the whole tale is going to be told, but I think a lot more people in the world are going to be agreeing with the premise here at World War Now that we are in the midst of the Third World War. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Yes, everyone on YouTube, Substack X, leave a comment wherever you're listening, Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well. These are all places where you can find us, but worldwarnow.co is the main place where you can get behind the paywall. Listen to this week's Ether Hour episode in full with Jose Nino, all about the Judeo Third World War, their hybrid warfare against Spain, the Francoist roots of Spain's anti-Zionism, what went down in Venezuela, a whole big conversation about, the Latin world, as it were, with our good friend Jose. So be sure to check that out. You also get access to our recent conversations with Father Peter Heers, our friend Christopher from the Holy Wisdom channel, Yaqub Saraf, former defense minister of Lebanon, Mike Painovich, so many other incredible guests. So be sure to check out worldwarnow.co and support us there. It's what keeps the lights on here at the proverbial World War Now bunker, but also become a free subscriber if you can't. It's really the best way to get our content. It's where everything gets released first, is there on Substack. So be sure to check that out. We want to keep rising through the Substack ranks. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube as well. I'm live every Tuesday evening on there. I'm answering super chats. If you don't want to get behind the paywall at Substack, or if you already are and want to keep supporting us even more, be sure to donate at the Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/World War Now. That's the best way to directly financially support us. They take the least amount of the cash. So thank you so much to everyone that has supported us there. Obviously, follow us on X at World War Now _. Be sure to follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. Be sure to check out our Ether Hour episodes this week and my discussion with Jay Burden. I'll probably have that linked down below. Really, really great discussion. It should be available for everybody in a few weeks. It's behind his paywall initially, but there's a free preview and it should eventually be released for everybody. And of course, be sure to check out antelopehillpublishing.com and use code WWN for 10% off all of your dissident book purchases. So again, thank you all so much for tuning in. Leave a like on this episode, specifically on Substack, but wherever else you may be listening as well. Go to worldwarnow.co to support us. Leave a comment to let us know what you thought of the episode. And again, thank you so much for tuning in. Keep Dmitry and I in your prayers, and we will see you on the next one. God bless.